I only needed shelter, but that unfinished globe seemed to know my family.
She was 21 and homeless. No bedroom, no winter coat, no address, just a cracked wooden box of sable brushes and $8 she had folded into the lining of her mother's black funeral dress. And with that $8, she bought a condemned globe maker's studio for $4 on a forgotten lane near Fox Point in Providence County, Rhode Island, a place the tax maps had stopped naming properly in 1979. Rain came through the roof in 3 places. One brick wall leaned hard enough to worry the street. The county had condemned it since 1998 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the unfinished oak core of a giant demonstration globe, behind a sealed wooden meridian ring that had not been opened in over 60 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Lyra Celeste Maren had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She learned waiting before she learned arithmetic, before she could spell her own middle name, before she understood that grown people could make a house feel colder than the weather outside it. In the apartment above the laundromat on Atwells Avenue, she waited for machines to finish turning, for quarters to appear in the blue ceramic jar beside the stove, for her mother's feet on the stairs after a double shift. She waited in rooms that smelled of starch, wet cotton, boiled coffee, and the faint metallic breath of radiators that knocked all night as though somebody were trapped inside the walls and trying to be exact about escape. Her mother, Elise, had a face that became delicate when she was tired, not because it grew softer, but because all unnecessary motion left it. She worked at a florist in the mornings, cleaning buckets and cutting stems under cold water, then at a residential care home in the afternoons, where her hands learned the patient labor of lifting, washing, buttoning, and listening. She brought home the bruised lilies that could not be sold, the bent tulips, the carnations with one browned edge, and she set them in a peanut butter jar on the sill. Lyra never remembered a time when there were not dying flowers in the house. They were never presented as sad. They were simply kept. Her own father had gone out of her life so early that he became less a person than a missing nail in a floorboard. People stepped around the absence. Her mother did not curse him, did not embroider him into villainy for comfort, did not pretend his leaving had been noble. When Lyra asked, Elise said, "Some people can carry love for only a little while." Then she rinsed the supper plates and looked toward the dark window above the sink. The man who came later had a more exact kind of quiet. Nathaniel Voss arrived when Lyra was 12, wearing pressed shirts and polished shoes, with a voice that never rose because it did not need to. He sold insurance, or said he did, though Lyra never saw a policy folder leave the house. He had a habit of placing his keys on the table one by one, as though the order of them proved a private law. He kept receipts in envelopes, envelopes in labelled boxes, boxes in the hall closet no one was permitted to touch. He spoke of discipline, investment, margins, and waste. He called flowers waste. He called paint waste. He called silence agreement. In those years, there was one place where waiting changed its shape. Every Saturday morning when the bell over the laundromat door was still asleep, and the first delivery trucks had not yet troubled the street, Lyra walked 6 blocks to her grandfather's rented room behind a closed sailmaker's shop near the harbour. His name was Tomasz Maren, though the neighbours called him Thomas because they could not hold the Polish shape of his name without apology. He had come to Rhode Island after the war with a tin trunk, 2 wool coats, and the memory of rivers whose names had been erased and redrawn by men at tables. He was not a cartographer by profession, not anymore in the old country. Before borders became arguments and arguments became uniforms, he had apprenticed under a maker of school globes and harbour charts. After he crossed the ocean, he repaired compasses, copied maritime diagrams for small museums, lettered boat names in gold leaf, and painted restaurant signs when hunger required him to be less proud. But on Saturdays he made worlds. His room was narrow and high-ceilinged, with one window that faced the brick side of another building. Yet to Lyra, it held more distance than any open field. Strings ran from wall to wall, clipped with drying paper gauze shaped like orange peels. Bowls of ground pigment rested beside shells filled with gum arabic. There were hare's foot brushes, squirrel mops, ruling pens, bone folders, a chipped marble slab, and jars labelled in his cramped hand. Verdigris, lamp black, yellow ochre, ultramarine ash, iron red. On a work table made from a door laid across two trestles stood half-made spheres, their surfaces layered with strips of paper and paste, until they looked like moons before weather. Tomasz taught slowly because he believed haste left fingerprints on the soul of an object. He showed Lyra how to tear linen paper so the fibres feathered, how to lay each strip of papier-mâché around a curve without buckling, how to smooth the seam with the side of her thumb instead of the tip. He mixed paste from wheat starch and warm water, stirring until the spoon made a clean wake. He stretched paper gauze around plaster forms and let them rest before trimming. He showed her how a globe was not one drawing wrapped around a ball, but many careful lies arranged so faithfully that truth could live among them. When she was 14, he allowed her to paint her first coastline. It was the coast of Rhode Island, not large enough on the little practice sphere to impress anybody who did not love exactness. She leaned close until her breath fogged the varnished curve. Her hand trembled over Narragansett Bay. Tomasz stood behind her with his fingers laced across his belly, saying nothing for so long that the city seemed to turn down its own volume. Then he placed one knuckle gently on the table. "Water forgives the eye," he said, "but land remembers the hand." She did not understand at first. She wanted praise, correction, something with an edge she could hold. He took the brush from her, added one patient inlet with a blue so thin it looked like the memory of rain, and handed it back. Years later, when she had slept under hedges and counted coins by the glow of vending machines, she would understand that he had not been speaking only of maps. A person could mistake a sea and still find shore, but what one did on land, in rooms, under roofs, beside beds where the dying breathed, left marks that stayed. Their ritual had rules: tea first, always black and oversteeped, then the sharpening of pencils, then the cleaning of brushes that were already clean, then work. At noon they ate dark bread, farmer cheese and sliced apples sprinkled with salt, a habit from Tomasz's childhood that Lyra found strange until she began to crave it. He told stories only after the first hour of labour because stories, like paint, needed a prepared surface. He told her about old globe makers in Amsterdam and London, about sailors who trusted charts drawn by men who had never crossed the seas they shaped, about the compass roses that bloomed in map corners like flowers of obedience. He spoke of providence too, of shipwrights, scrimshaw cutters, engravers, instrument repairers, women who stitched sails, men who carved figureheads, families whose names remained only on ledgers and stones. He said the harbour had taught the city to look outward and inward at the same time. Every honest craft, he told her one November, while rain ran down the window and the room smelled of paste, is a way of refusing disappearance. He did not say this grandly. He said it while scraping dried glue from a brush ferrule with his thumbnail. That was why Lyra believed him. To refuse disappearance did not mean becoming known. It meant sanding, mending, copying the faint line before it vanished, writing a name clearly enough that the next hand could read it. When Tomasz died, he left very little that the law could weigh. A winter cough became pneumonia. Pneumonia became a hospital bed with lifted rails, a plastic pitcher, and the slow ticking of an IV pump. Lyra sat beside him with a sketchbook on her knees, drawing the pattern of veins on the back of his hand, because she could not draw the leaving itself. He woke once near dawn and asked whether the brushes had been washed. She said yes, though she had not been to the room in 3 days. He nodded, relieved by a lie that served mercy instead of fear. After the burial, Nathaniel handled the room. He said there was no sense in paying another month's rent on clutter. He said the landlord was impatient. He said grief made people sentimental, and sentiment made them foolish. By the time Lyra found courage to ask for the tin trunk, the pigments, the practice globes, the work table door, the clipped paper gauze, the notebooks filled with formulas and place names, most of it had already gone to a man with a van who bought estate remnants by the pound. She recovered only the brush box because it had been under Tomasz's cot, wrapped in a pillowcase, overlooked by efficiency. Inside were 12 brushes, some worn down almost to the ferrule, each handle darkened where fingers had held it for years. A slip of paper lay beneath them with her name written in Tomasz's hand, for Lyra. Keep the fine lines honest. She folded the paper once, then again, and kept it in the back of the box. Her mother did not stop Nathaniel. That was the first betrayal Lyra understood without anybody naming it. Elise stood in the doorway that evening, thinner than the dress she wore, twisting her wedding ring around and around until the skin beneath it shone pale. She looked at the brush box in Lyra's arms, then at the hallway where Nathaniel was speaking to someone on the telephone about deductions. Her mouth opened. Nothing came. The silence sat down among them and remained. In the years that followed, Lyra became careful with hope. She finished high school by working evenings at a frame shop, where she learned to cut mats and clean old glass without scratching it. She took community college classes in illustration and archival preservation, carrying second-hand textbooks in a canvas bag repaired at the corners with dental floss. Her mother had once promised that Tomasz's savings, together with what Elise had put away, would pay for a proper art college after 2 years. There was an account, there were statements, there were conversations held softly at the kitchen table while Nathaniel was out, conversations folded away when his key turned in the lock. Then Elise grew ill. Not dramatically, not all at once. Illness entered the house like a draught under a door, almost deniable at first. A missed shift, a cough she pressed into a handkerchief, a chair pulled closer to the sink because standing too long made the room tilt. The florist let her go kindly, which did not make the lost wages kinder. The care home sent a card signed by residents who missed the way she hummed while changing sheets. Nathaniel spoke of premiums and deductibles. Lyra worked more hours and took fewer classes. She painted at night when she could, small watercolour maps of imaginary islands, selling 3 at a holiday market for enough to buy medicine, rice, and a pair of wool socks for her mother. By the final week, Elise had become nearly soundless. She lay in the front room because the stairs were too steep, under a quilt Tomasz had brought across the ocean and patched with fabric from shirts, curtains, and one blue dress Lyra remembered wearing at 6. Nathaniel moved through the house with an air of being inconvenienced by sacred things. He answered calls on the porch. He kept files at the dining table when visitors came. He received them with lowered eyes and a practiced patience that made women from the church press his hand. On the night after the funeral, rain struck the windows with a steady, deliberate tapping. Lyra had not yet taken the pins from her hair. Her black dress smelled of lilies, damp wool, and the closed velvet of the funeral home. She was standing beside the stove, heating water for tea she did not want, when she heard a drawer open in the bedroom upstairs. Then another. Then the dragging sound of a suitcase across the floor. Nathaniel came down carrying her canvas bag, the brush box, a stack of folded clothes, and the dented tin where she kept class notes and old photographs. He had placed everything with exact neatness, as though tidiness could make cruelty look like order. Behind him, in the hall, her mother's quilt lay folded over his arm. He set the bag by the door. The physical thing she remembered most was not the bag, not the dress, not even the brush box held too tightly against her ribs. It was a grocery receipt stuck to the wet sole of his shoe, darkening from the rain he had tracked across the floor. It clung there while he spoke, a small paper proof that ordinary life had continued somewhere else. You have $8. Go, make yourself useful. 8 words. He did not shout them. That would have given the moment a heat it did not deserve. He said them with the flatness of a man closing a ledger. From the mantel her mother's framed photograph watched without accusation, without rescue, without even the power to turn away. In the picture, Elise was younger, holding a jar of bent tulips and smiling at someone just to the left of the camera. That smile had once made a room safer. Now it belonged to paper and glass. Lyra looked at the stairs, at the quilt, at the cup waiting beside the stove. She understood then that some betrayals are not committed by a hand raised in anger, but by a hand lowered in exhaustion years before. Her mother had yielded inch by inch, receipt by receipt, silence by silence. until there was no room left in the house for her daughter's name. Lyra bent to pick up the bag. Nathaniel opened the door before she reached it. Rain entered first, cold and finely angled. The porch light threw a yellow square across the steps. She did not ask where she was meant to go. A question would have required him to imagine an answer, and she had learned not to spend herself on impossible purchases. She walked until the house was no longer visible behind her. For the first week, she slept badly in Providence because the city knew her too well. She spent the first night on a bench near India Point Park, wrapped in her mother's funeral dress beneath her coat, with the brush box under her head. The wind came from the bay and carried the smell of diesel, salt, wet rope and leaf rot. At dawn, she washed her face in a public restroom where the fluorescent light made every living person look already forgiven or already lost. She bought coffee for $1.15 because heat seemed necessary, then regretted it by noon. The second night she found the unlocked vestibule of a church near College Hill and slept sitting up until a custodian with silver hair touched the pew beside her, not her shoulder, and said, "You can rest till 6. He brought her a paper cup of water. He did not ask her story. That restraint was the first mercy she received. By the 4th day, she had $6.23. She took the bus to Pawtucket because she had once seen a flyer there for seasonal work in a packing room. The job was gone by the time she arrived. The woman at the counter looked at Lyra's thin shoes, then wrote down the address of a shelter on the back of a deposit slip. The shelter was full. Lyra slept beneath the overhang of a closed pharmacy with 2 other women, one who snored softly into a purple scarf and one who murmured the names of saints each time a truck passed. A week later, she crossed into Central Falls, then back again, because movement gave hunger something to do. She learned which libraries allowed a person to sit long without proving purpose. She learned the hours when grocery stores marked down bread. She learned that bus stations at night were warmer near vending machines, colder near doors, and that men who smiled too quickly required distance. She kept the brush box wrapped in a sweater at the bottom of her bag. Once, in a diner restroom, she opened it just to smell the handles. Linseed oil, dust, and the faint mineral bitterness of old pigment rose like a country she had not been able to save. By the 3rd week, she had $3.87. She walked south as far as Cranston one cold afternoon because somebody in line at a soup kitchen said a warehouse needed people to sort returned catalogue orders. The foreman looked at her hands, narrow and cracked, then at the brush box corded to her bag. He said the positions had been filled. A woman leaving the warehouse pressed 2 clementines into Lyra's palm without slowing down. Lyra ate one behind a laundromat and saved the other until the skin hardened. She tried not to count days, then counted them anyway. On the 31st night, she slept in Roger Williams Park beneath a stone shelter where the benches held the day's cold like a grudge. Her feet had blistered, healed badly and blistered again. Her dress was no longer black, but a tired charcoal where the hem had drunk mud. She placed the brush box inside her coat, against her stomach, and woke whenever she felt it shift. In the dark, geese moved somewhere near the water, their bodies making low disturbances in the reeds. Snow came once, briefly, a thin early dusting that vanished by morning but left the world outlined in judgment. She stood in line outside a mission in Warwick with her arms folded around herself, and listened to a man explain to another man that a person could always start over in America. He said it as if starting over were a door kept unlocked for anyone polite enough to turn the knob. By the 6th week, Lyra had $1.16, Vone clementine gone dry in her bag, and a cough that seemed to have found a settled place behind her ribs. She had stopped thinking about art college. She had stopped thinking about Nathaniel, except in the way one thinks about a locked room after leaving the building. She had not stopped thinking about Tomasz. His sentences came at inconvenient times when she was too hungry to welcome wisdom. Water forgives the eye. Land remembers the hand. Every honest craft is a way of refusing disappearance. Keep the fine lines honest. The words did not feed her. They did keep her from throwing away the brushes. On a Thursday morning washed in hard blue light, She entered the Knight Memorial Library because the doors had opened and because the reading room held heat without demanding proof of belonging. She chose a chair near the local history shelves where nobody hurried. Her coat steamed faintly as it dried. She placed the brush box on her lap under the table and opened the newspaper to avoid being noticed. The classified section had become thinner than she remembered from childhood, half advertisements for estate cleanouts, storage auctions, rooms for rent, and notices written in county language that sounded dead before it reached the page. Her eyes passed over words without taking them in. Snow tires, used freezer, piano needs tuning, tax sale, abandoned parcel, demolition lien. Then she saw the line. Absent owner property liquidation. Structure unsafe. Minimum bid $4. Cash only. Former handcraft workshop. Fox Point vicinity. Inquire Providence County Clerk. Widibida 3. Friday. 9 a.m. She read it once, then again, pressing a finger beneath each word as though the sentence might move if not held down. Former handcraft workshop. It was a phrase wide enough to mean anything and poor enough to mean nothing to most people. To her, it opened like a drawer. She looked at the date. Thursday. The sale was the next morning. A librarian with cropped grey hair came by pushing a cart of returned books. She paused at the table, not looking directly at Lyra's damp sleeves, and set down a pencil that had rolled near the edge. Need scrap paper, dear? Lyra nodded. The woman tore a blank corner from a withdrawn checkout slip and placed it beside the newspaper. Her name tag read Miriam. She smelled faintly of cloves and paper dust. Lyra copied the notice carefully, including the punctuation, then folded the scrap and tucked it into the brush box under Tomash's note. At noon, she used the library restroom to wash her face and comb her hair with her fingers. In the mirror, she looked less like a young woman than a candle that had been carried too long through wind. She removed the last bill from the lining of her dress and laid her coins beside the sink. $1 bill, 16 cents. The bus to downtown would take $1. That left 16 cents, the brush box and the notice. If she walked, she could keep the $1. If she kept the $1, she could bid. The arithmetic was honest. She left the library before evening, because deciding required air. The walk back toward Providence took hours. Her shoes scraped against sidewalks glazed by a thin skin of ice in shaded places. Cars passed with their windows sealed, each interior holding a private weather. She crossed bridges, followed bus routes by memory, rested twice on low stone walls, and watched the city gather itself into lamps. Near the river, a gull stood on one leg atop a piling and opened its beak without making any sound. By the time she reached downtown, the county building had long been closed. She stood across the street and looked at its lit upper windows, the columns, the flag moving in a careful dark. The place did not know her. That was a comfort. A person could sometimes enter a room more freely when no one inside had learned the shape of her failures. She spent that night in the recessed doorway of a closed tailor's shop, knees drawn up, bag looped twice around her wrist. Rain began after midnight, not heavy rain, only a patient mist that silvered the sidewalk and beaded on the wool of her coat. She did not sleep much. Whenever she drifted, she saw paper gauze drying on lines in her grandfather's room, each one curved and waiting to become part of a world. Before dawn, she opened the brush box in the dark. The 12 handles lay in their shallow grooves. Tomash's folded note remained tucked beneath them. She took it out and held it between 2 fingers, not unfolding it, because she knew every word. For Lyra, keep the fine lines honest. Then she removed the $1 bill from her dress lining, smoothed it on her knee, and placed it under the note, as if the dead man were being asked to witness a purchase no sensible living person would approve. At 8:30, she crossed the street. The county building smelled of floor wax, damp wool, and coffee burned down to bitterness. People moved through the lobby carrying folders, small disputes, applications, complaints, proofs of marriage, proofs of death, proofs of ownership, proofs that some part of their lives had become official enough to require a stamp. Lyra stood near the directory until her hands stopped shaking. Window 3 was down a corridor beneath a sign that read tax title and vacant parcels. There were 2 people ahead of her. One man wanted records for a garage. One woman argued about a fence. Lyra listened to the clerk answer each person with a patience that had hardened from use. Behind the glass, a brass stamp rested beside an ink pad, a stack of deeds, and a chipped mug filled with rulers instead of pens. When her turn came, she slid the scrap of paper under the opening. The clerk adjusted her glasses. She was a broad-shouldered woman with a careful grey braid pinned at the nape of her neck and a nameplate that read MRS. Evelyn Porter. She looked at the notice, then at Lyra, then at the brushbox held against her coat. You came for the Fox Point structure. Yes. Ma'am. You have seen it? No. Ma'am. Mrs. Porter's mouth tightened in a way that was not unkind. She opened a folder, turned 2 pages, and set one finger on a line. Outside, somewhere beyond the courthouse walls, a truck backed up with 3 slow beeps. The minimum bid is $4. Lyra's hand went to the lining of her dress. For one brief, unreasonable second, the whole world seemed to narrow to a single bill folded into a seam by a woman who had no other hiding place. She took it out carefully, $1, then another from the envelope Miriam had not given her because there was no envelope. No, she had 4 single bills, not 1. 2 had been tucked deeper, flattened against the hem where she had forgotten their separate survival. The discovery made her knees weak, not from hope, but from the embarrassment of almost having miscounted her own life. She placed the $4 on the counter. Mrs. Porter did not touch them at once. Child, she said. Her voice lower now. This is not a house. Lyra looked at the papers, not at the clerk's face. I understand. It has no certificate of occupancy. Yes. Ma'am. The roof has failed. Yes. Ma'am. The county wants the liability gone. Yes. Ma'am. If you sign, you accept back taxes, liens, condition, and risk. Yes. Ma'am. There was a pause long enough for the building to make its own judgment. A radiator clicked. A drawer slid open somewhere behind the glass. Mrs. Porter took the money finally, smoothing each bill with the side of her thumb, and wrote a receipt in blue ink. Lyra signed where she was told. Her signature looked too thin on the page, a line drawn by someone standing in the cold. The brass stamp came down with a sound that seemed larger than the transaction deserved. Mrs. Porter tore off the receipt, folded it once, and passed it under the glass, along with a copy of the deed and a key sealed in a brittle evidence envelope. Old lock may not take, she said. Bring oil. Lyra placed the papers inside the brushbox. She did not yet know the road. She did not yet know the lane, the listing wall, the ruined sign, the roof waiting with its open seams, or the patient dark inside the brick building where no lamp had burned for decades. She knew only that a key, however useless it might prove, had been given into her keeping. Outside. The morning had brightened without becoming warm. She stood on the courthouse steps while people moved around her, each carrying some private weather. In her box were 12 brushes, Vone folded note, a deed no sensible person would envy, and the last $4 of a life that had not yet learned what it had purchased. By noon, she would be walking east toward the forgotten lane by the water, and by dusk she would see the globe maker's studio for the first time. The first bus pulled away from the curb before she had decided whether to chase it. She watched its red tail lights draw themselves through the mist toward the river, then disappear behind the stone corner of a bank whose windows were still black with mourning. Her shoes were wet already, not from deep rain, but from the kind of Rhode Island dampness that rose from the pavement and entered by seams, eyelets, hems, and old decisions. The courthouse receipt lay folded inside the brush box, pressed beneath the note and the deed, so close to her ribs that each step made the papers whisper. A later bus would have taken her most of the way east, but the last coins in her pocket had begun to feel less like money than proof of thought. She stood beneath the route sign, read the schedule twice, and then turned away from it. It was not courage. Courage was too large a word for that hour. It was arithmetic, and hunger, and the knowledge that a person who has bought a building for less than a meal ought to learn the distance to it with her own feet. The streets near downtown were busy enough that she could disappear in plain sight. Office workers passed with paper cups and lowered faces. A delivery man rolled a handcart over the curb, the wheels striking each crack with a dry wooden complaint. Somewhere a church bell counted 9. Then the sound thinned above the roofs, and was taken by the wind coming up from the bay. She walked east, following directions written on the back of a tax notice by the clerk's square, efficient hand. South Water, Wickenden, past the shops, under the old overpass. Look for the lane after the second wharf road, no city sign remaining. She did not know whether the clerk had meant the directions kindly or simply accurately, but she had written them as though the place could still be found by a person willing to notice what the city had stopped maintaining. By late morning, the mist had become a colder rain. It did not fall hard enough to make anyone pity her from a window. It only settled. It darkened the shoulders of her coat and glued loose strands of hair to her temples. She passed a bakery with fogged glass, a marine supply store with coils of rope stacked in the window, a shuttered framing shop, a cafe where 2 women leaned toward each other over white cups, and a funeral florist arranging yellow roses in a metal bucket. The flowers made her stop, though not for long. There are some smells the body recognizes before the mind grants permission. Near the river, she rested under the awning of a closed bait shop and ate the last dry segment of the clementine she had carried too long. It tasted of bitterness and dust. Across the street, a gull lifted from a dumpster with a piece of bread in its beak, beat the air twice and settled on a roof edge with the solemn authority of ownership. The walk should have taken less than an hour for someone fed, warm and certain. For her it became the work of a day. Her feet had learned blisters in layers, and every downhill grade pressed them forward inside the worn shoes until her toes felt separately bruised. Twice she took out the evidence envelope and looked at the key through the brittle plastic. It was iron, blackened by age, with a long shank and a round bow polished bright along one edge, where other hands had once used it often. The sight of use steadied her. A key worn by fingers meant that, once, a door had opened. She reached the clerk's described turn by mid-afternoon and found no sign. There was only a narrow lane between a warehouse with boarded windows and a fenced yard where stacks of cracked pallets leaned against one another in the weeds. The lane ran toward the water, though the water itself was hidden behind brick, chain link, and the low grey hum of industry. She stood at the mouth of it and looked down the broken pavement. Grass had entered through the cracks, and the rain had gathered in shallow black mirrors where the surface had sunk. At the far end, beyond a leaning utility pole and a walnut tree gone bare for the season, rose a brick shape with a roofline broken enough to look bitten. She did not go in yet. Her body, which had carried her as far as it could on argument, made its own refusal. She backed away from the lane and found shelter in a hay barn she had passed half a mile before, behind a feed supplier whose sign promised cracked corn, salt blocks and bedding straw. The barn stood open on one side, used mostly for storage now, with square bales stacked beneath a corrugated overhang, and the smell of dust, sweet grass, mice, and old summer held in their dry cores. No one saw her enter, or, if someone did, no one called out. That night the temperature fell to 31 degrees. She knew because a radio in the feed office had played the forecast while a man locked the front door and drove away, leaving the announcer's voice to travel through the plank wall in pieces. She made herself a place between 2 bales, spread the funeral dress over her knees, and put the brush box beneath her coat. Rain tapped the metal roof. Somewhere under the floorboards, a small animal moved with delicate feet. The hay scratched her wrists, but it held the day's faint warmth better than stone. She did not sleep quickly. The new deed made sleep formal. It changed the darkness around her. She had spent weeks resting wherever she could without belonging, training herself to rise before being found, to leave no shape behind. But now a piece of paper said that one ruined structure, with its failed roof and county warnings, had become her responsibility, not safety. Responsibility. The word settled heavier than a blanket and less kindly. In the night, a truck passed on the road beyond the barn. Its headlights swept through the gaps between planks and laid brief pale stripes across the bales. Her hands, the brush box, the plastic envelope containing the key. Then the dark came back, fuller for having been interrupted. At dawn, frost silvered the weeds along the road. She woke with her jaw aching from cold and her fingers curled around the brushbox latch. The sky had cleared, leaving the world washed thin and exact. She brushed hay from her coat, thanked the empty barn with one nod because thanks needed someplace to go, and walked back toward town by the same road, past the feed supplier, past the wharf yard, past the place where the lane opened like an omitted sentence. The town, or the last working pocket of it, was smaller by daylight than it had seemed in rain. It held 5 businesses in a row of tired dignity along the older street, Delaney's Hardware, with snow shovels already leaning beside the door, the Blue Kettle Cafe, where steam clouded the windows and handwritten pie names stood on a chalkboard, Harbour Thread and Alteration, its display holding one navy suit and a child's christening dress under plastic, Pell Marine Salvage with brass fittings, compass housings and a cracked ship's wheel in the window, and a pharmacy called St. Anne's whose green cross flickered even in daylight. Above them were apartments with curtains faded by salt and sun. Below them the sidewalk tilted toward drains filled with leaves. A bell rang over the cafe door when someone went in, releasing coffee smell and a brief warmth that reached the sidewalk before closing again. The smell moved through her sharply. She kept walking. At the corner stood a small annex building with a county seal painted beside the entrance, older than the main courthouse and less confident of itself. Vacant parcels and registry satellite. Office was lettered in black on frosted glass. The clerk had told her she could obtain the physical plat there, along with any utility notes the county still had. She had not mentioned that the office would look like a former bank, with a marble threshold worn concave at the centre from decades of feet. Inside, heat struck her face. It was not strong heat, only radiator heat, metallic and dry, but it made her eyes water. The room held 3 desks, 2 high filing cabinets, a counter with a scarred wooden top, and a wall map of Providence County dated so long ago that several road names had changed, and one whole industrial tract still appeared as marsh. On the counter sat a brass handbell no one had rung in years, its surface browned where the polish had given up. The woman behind the desk did not look up immediately. She was writing in a ledger with a fountain pen, making figures in columns so straight they seemed to have been ruled by temperament alone. Her hair was braided and pinned as before, though today a few silver wisps had escaped near her ear. The same nameplate rested on the counter, transferred here or duplicated there. MRS Evelyn Porter. Beside it stood a small ceramic jar filled with sharpened pencils, all pointing upward with a disciplined optimism. "You came back, Mrs." Porter said, still writing. "Yes." "Ma'am." "You found the lane." "Yes." "Ma'am." The clerk finished a number, blotted it, capped the pen, and finally looked at her. In daylight, beyond courthouse glass, her face showed more than procedure. There were lines at the corners of her mouth that seemed made by restraint rather than laughter. Her eyes went to the wet hem of the dress. The hay caught on one sleeve, then to the brush box. "You slept somewhere cold." The young woman did not answer. "Mrs." Porter stood, crossed to the filing cabinet, and opened the 3rd drawer from the top. The drawer resisted. She gave it a practiced pull, the kind a person uses on furniture that has been failing slowly for years and deserves no anger for it. I need you to understand several things before I hand over the full packet, she said. Yes. Ma'am. She laid a folder on the counter, then placed one palm flat on it. The county closed that building for structural risk. Yes, ma'am. There is no water service noted after 1998. Yes, ma'am. The electrical meter was removed before my niece was born. Yes, ma'am. The rear wall has frost heave, and the roof may not hold a heavy snow. Yes, ma'am. The prior owner vanished from record, and no heir responded to notice. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Porter watched her with the measured weariness of a woman who had seen poor people mistake a burden for rescue, and rich people mistake law for innocence. Then she added, softer, it may cost more to make safe than it will ever be worth. Yes, ma'am. Do not say that unless you understand it. The room became still around them. A pipe knocked once in the wall. Outside, a bus sighed at the curb and lowered itself for an elderly man with a cane. The young woman placed both hands on the counter. They were chapped across the knuckles, clean where she had washed them in cold water, marked at the thumb by old pigment that had never fully left. She did not lift her voice. I understand enough to know I have nowhere else to sign for. Mrs. Porter looked down at the folder. The sentence had not asked for pity, and perhaps that was why the clerk allowed it to stand. She opened the folder and drew out a narrow plat map, a photocopy of the condemnation order, a tax certificate, a utility absence note, and a document listing assessed value as if the figure were a joke told by a tired machine. Then she opened a lower drawer and removed a heavy brass stamp mounted on a wooden handle worn black with use. The stamp came down once on the packet. The sound carried through the room, decisive and almost tender. Mrs. Porter wrote the directions again, this time on a larger sheet torn from a yellow legal pad. She drew the lane, the walnut tree, the neighbouring salvage yard, the slope of the ground, the place where the pavement broke near a buried drain. Her handwriting was exact. She marked an X where the front entrance should be and another where a side door might still open if the frame had not shifted. You will want oil for that key, she said. I do not have oil. You will want it anyway. Mrs. Porter turned to the pencil jar and selected one, then made a small notation on the map. Delaney. ASK for Ruth. She pushed it across the counter. For the first time, the clerk's gaze settled not on the brush box, but on the name printed at the top of the deed. Maren, she said. The young woman's shoulders tightened. The clerk did not miss it. Her eyes moved once toward the old county map on the wall, then back to the paper. She picked up the deed and read the surname again, as if confirming a sound from far away. There was a Maren who used to come through this office years ago, Mrs. Porter said. Not often. Tall, stooped by then, carried rolled charts in a canvas tube. He asked about coastal plats, defunct workshops, harbour rights. My mother worked this counter before me. She remembered him because he always sharpened our dull pencils while he waited. The young woman said nothing. He repaired a globe once for the Historical Society, Mrs. Porter continued. A school globe with half the Pacific rubbed away. My mother said he painted the islands back one by one, though no one had paid him for that much care. The room seemed to recede behind the words. Mrs. Porter lowered the deed. Was he kin to you? The answer came carefully, because grief had learned to conserve itself. He taught me maps. That was all she trusted herself to say. The clerk accepted it as full. For a moment, her sternness shifted, not leaving her face, but rearranging within it. She opened a side drawer and took out a small bottle of machine oil, the kind used for hinges and stubborn locks. Its paper label stained at the edges. Beside it, she placed a folded paper packet. Crackers, she said. From my lunch. Take both. I can't pay. I did not ring them up. The young woman looked at the oil, then at the crackers, then at the clerk's hands resting beside them. The hands were square, veined, capable of filing, stamping, refusing, granting. One fingernail held a line of blue ink where the pen had leaked. "Thank you," she said. "Mrs." Porter tapped the map. "Do not go inside if the front lintel has dropped. Use the side door. If you smell gas, leave. If you hear cracking overhead, leave. If anyone from the salvage yard troubles you, say the county knows you're there." "Yes, ma'am." "And, child." She paused at the door. Whatever that place was, it was not nothing. The sentence followed her outside. The day had warmed just enough to loosen frost from the curb. Water ticked down gutters. Cars rolled past with their tires making a softened sound on damp pavement. She stood under the county annex awning and ate 2 crackers slowly, 1/2 at a time, because the body sometimes mistrusted sudden kindness. The salt stung a split in her lip. She put the rest away. Then she walked toward Delaney's hardware. The bell over the door was not a bell, but a length of chain hung with 3 brass washers that chimed against one another when she entered. Warm air met her, carrying the smells of oiled wood, loose nails, stove black, burlap, kerosene, and the dry mineral dust of plaster. Every wall held something useful. Coils of rope, copper pipe, handsaws, lantern chimneys, hinges, screw eyes, mouse traps, stove gaskets, paintbrushes, sash cord, roofing felt, seed packets left over from spring, and drawers with handwritten labels, brass brads, cotter pins, rosehead nails, escutcheon plates. At the back, a woman stood on a step stool counting boxes of furnace filters. She had close-cropped white hair, brown skin weathered by sun, and wrists as narrow as broom handles. Her apron read Delaney's in faded red thread, though she moved with the authority of someone who owned not just the shop, but the habits of everyone in it. She climbed down without hurry. "You need something." It was not a question. "Machine oil." "The county clerk," said Ruth. "Porter sent you." "Yes." "Ma'am." "Then you already have oil." The young woman took out the bottle, embarrassed. Ruth Delaney nodded once, as if this confirmed the whole history of public offices and stubborn locks. "Then you need advice, which is worse and costs more." "I cannot pay for that either. Most people who can pay do not listen." Ruth came around the counter and looked at the map, then at the key in its plastic sleeve. She did not ask where the girl had slept. She did not ask why she had bought a condemned building. Practical people sometimes have the mercy of beginning with the hinge. "You will try the side door first," Ruth said. "Front frame was bad 10 years ago. If the key turns, do not force the door wide. Push an inch. Wait. Listen. Raccoons. Boards. Loose plaster. If it sticks, lift while you push. If it opens, leave it open. Air first. Always air first." The young woman repeated the words silently, not in thought, but with her lips barely moving, storing them. Ruth noticed. She reached beneath the counter and brought out a stub of carpenter's pencil. "Write on the back of the legal pad map." The girl wrote as Ruth spoke. "Side door. Oil. Lift latch. Air first. Test floor with heel near joist. Do not trust stairs. Chimney closed until swept. No fire until swept. No water from pipes. Find roof leaks before dark. Keep one clear path out." The list looked severe, and therefore kind. Ruth added a box of wooden matches, 2 short candles, and a coil of thin twine to the counter. The young woman stepped back. "I cannot." Ruth placed one finger on the matches. "You are not buying." You are being made less likely to die in a building my cousin has wanted torn down since 2002. There is a difference. The young woman swallowed. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. You may hate the place by sundown. Outside the street had settled into afternoon. The cafe windows shone with steam. At the alteration shop, a woman in a green sweater turned the sign from closed to open and shook crumbs from a cloth onto the sidewalk for sparrows. A black dog lay in the doorway of the salvage yard office with his chin on his paws, watching every passerby as if keeping a ledger of intentions. The lane waited beyond the last row of businesses. She reached it with the map folded in one hand and the brushbox strap across her shoulder. The dog rose when she turned in. He was large, greying around the muzzle, with one ear torn into a permanent notch. He did not bark. He walked as far as the edge of the salvage yard fence and stood there, tail level, eyes exact. I own it, she told him, then felt foolish. The dog blinked. From a garage bay behind him came the clatter of metal and a radio playing an old hymn through static. No one emerged. She continued down the lane. The walnut trees began halfway in, 3 of them on the left, planted long ago in a line that had stopped being straight as the ground settled and roots found their own argument. Their branches were leafless, intricate, black against the pale sky, and the ground below them was littered with broken shells from squirrels. The smell changed as she passed beneath them, less street, more earth, wet bark, old husks, cold mud. On the right behind chain link lay the salvage yard, rusted radiators, brass lamps, torn awnings, boat cleats, lengths of iron pipe, porcelain sinks with their stains open to the weather, a row of doors leaning together like men at a wake. On the left, between the trees and a low stone retaining wall, the brick building waited. It was smaller than fear had made it and larger than hope could afford. The front was 2 stories high, though the upper floor looked more like a loft, with a narrow row of long windows beneath the roofline. The walls were red brick, darkened almost purple where rain had kept them wet. Many bricks had softened at the edges, their faces rounded by salt air and time. The roof was steep, slate originally, patched later with asphalt shingles, then tar, then sheets of rusted metal that had buckled at the seams. One corner sagged near the chimney, which rose square and blunt from the rear slope, its top course missing several bricks. The building measured, by her pacing, about 28 feet across and 40 feet deep. A modest workshop, not a factory. The front door stood under a shallow wooden hood supported by 2 brackets carved into curled shapes black with rot. Above the door, hanging from one chain and a stubborn nail, was a sign so weathered that she had to step close before the lettering appeared. M. Bellamy daughter. Terrestrial and celestial globes. Charts repired. Student models. Instrument cases. The final S in globes had peeled away, leaving a pale ghost behind. Beneath the sign, someone had nailed a county notice in orange paper inside a plastic sleeve, though water had entered and blurred the ink. UN safe structure. NO occupancy. Demolition review pending. The front wall leaned, but not as dramatically as the clerk had warned, or perhaps warning had made the actual angle bearable. Mortar had fallen from joints near the foundation. A narrow crack climbed from the left windowsill toward the sign, fine as a pencil line at first, wider near the top. One lower window had no glass, only plywood grey with weather. Another held a single triangle of pane at the upper corner, sharp and clean, reflecting the sky like a piece of trapped water. She went to the side door. It stood beneath the second walnut tree, half shielded by a tangle of wild grapevine and a stack of bricks furred with moss. The door itself was oak, swollen, blackened near the bottom with a strap hinge that had pulled loose at one screw. The lock plate was green with age. She took out Mrs. Porter's oil and placed 2 drops where metal entered metal. Ruth had said to wait. She waited. A chickadee moved in the walnut branches above her, making its small, neat sound. She inserted the key. For a moment nothing happened. The old iron seemed to meet only refusal. She held the bow with both hands, not forcing, only keeping a patient pressure. feeling for some remembered path inside the lock. Then something within gave a dry internal click, like a bone set back properly. The key turned. She lifted while pushing. The door opened 1 inch. She stopped, as instructed, and listened. The building breathed out. Not a human breath, not anything ghostly, but the long-sealed exhale of damp wood, mouse nests, old paper, plaster dust, cold soot, and trapped summer from decades before. The smell came over her in layers. Earth first, then mould, then something mineral and chalky, then the dry, faint sweetness of aged paste. So familiar that her hand tightened on the latch. She pushed wider and waited again. No crack overhead, no rush of animals, no collapsing plaster, only the tick of water somewhere inside, falling at intervals into a metal pan or perhaps onto a hollow surface. She tied the door back with Ruth's twine, looping it around a pipe fixed to the wall, and stood at the threshold until her eyes adjusted. The first room had once been a receiving room or shop. Light entered through the broken front windows in grey bands, showing a counter along one wall, 2 display shelves, a desk with one leg propped on a brick, and a long glass case whose top had caved inward under fallen plaster. The floorboards were wide pine, cupped from damp, scattered with leaves that had blown in and settled against the baseboards. On the far wall, ghost rectangles marked where framed charts had hung. A wooden rack still held 3 rolled maps tied with string, but when she touched one lightly, the paper gave a brittle sigh, and she drew her hand back. The ceiling above the front room had water stains shaped like islands. A section near the left corner had opened entirely, exposing lath and a dark view into the loft. Plaster lay on the floor beneath it in curved pieces, some showing the ridged imprint of the wood strips that had once held them. She stepped only where the boards met joists, testing with her heel as Ruth had told her. The building answered each step with a different voice. One board creaked sharply, another gave a low settled groan, another remained silent, which she trusted least of all. The counter held a ledger, swollen shut. Beside it lay a brass compass without glass, a wooden-handled awl, 2 rusted clamps, a cracked porcelain palette, and a jar of dried paste with its brush standing upright. The bristles fused into a brown flame. Dust lay over everything, but not evenly. Water had made paths, mice had made others. A moth, dead long enough to be nearly transparent, rested on the edge of an invoice spike. She did not touch much. The room did not feel ready for hands. Beyond the counter, a wide doorway opened into the back workshop. She stood before it longer than she meant to. The air there was colder. The smell of old paper grew stronger, joined by cedar oak and the faint sourness of varnish gone bad. When she raised Ruth's candle and struck a match, the flame leaned toward the room as if drawn. The back room held the work of a vanished family in patient disorder. Tables stood in rows, some collapsed, some still square. Shelves climbed the walls to the ceiling. There were wooden forms of many sizes, from spheres no bigger than apples to shoulder-wide globes mounted on crude stands. Half-finished hemispheres rested in crates. Thin paper gauze hung from a line near the rear wall, curled inward from damp-like leaves. A treadle lathe stood under a canvas sheet stiff with dust. Metal meridian rings leaned in a corner beside bundles of thin dowel, warped veneers, and a stack of school globe bases with their brass arcs tarnished nearly black. And at the centre of the room stood the giant globe. It was taller than she was by a head, mounted in an oak cradle whose wheels had sunk slightly into the floor. The surface was incomplete, half covered in paper, half still showing the wooden ribs and curved planks beneath. Continents had been sketched but not painted. Africa appeared in faint brown pencil. The Atlantic was only a wash of blue-grey primer, rubbed thin in places by time. Along one side, the meridian ring had been fitted but not finished, its edge carved with small marks that looked decorative until she leaned closer and saw they were degree lines. Water dripped somewhere behind it. Tick. Then silence. Tick. The sound made the room feel measured. She moved around the globe with the candle lifted, On the far side, a metal basin had been placed long ago beneath a roof leak and forgotten there. It was nearly full, its surface black and trembling with each drop from above. The roof hole was not large, but it was steady. Patient damage is still damage. She looked up and saw daylight through a split seam where slate had slipped, a narrow grey wound above the rafters. The floor near the basin was soft, so she retreated. There was no stove heat yet, no bed, no water, no clean corner waiting to become home by sentiment alone. The place had been closed, left, soaked, frozen, warmed, entered by animals, and declared unfit by people whose job was to make such declarations in ink. She knew all this. Knowing did not lessen it. Yet the workshop held lines. That was what reached her first and deepest lines on half-drawn maps, lines of latitude marked with a ruling pen, lines where shelves met brick, lines where wet paper had been cut and matched around curves, lines of craft interrupted but not erased. The room had not been emptied by triumph or completion. It had stopped mid-breath. She set the candle in a saucer on the least warped table and opened her brush box. Not to work. Not yet. The gesture was simply a greeting. The 12 brushes lay inside, grave and thin. She placed the box on the table beside a cracked porcelain palette that might have belonged to a stranger, and might have belonged to someone whose hands would have known her grandfather's hands by their habits. For a few minutes, nothing in the room moved except the candle flame and the falling water. Toward evening, she prepared for the first night inside. She chose the front room because it had the clearest path to the side door and fewer ceiling wounds. She swept one corner with a bundle of dry reeds found near the back entrance, moving leaves, mouse droppings, plaster and dust into a careful pile. From the display shelves she took 2 boards that were loose but not rotten and laid them across a low place in the floor. She did not trust them fully, only enough. She spread the funeral dress over the boards, then her coat, then placed the brush box beneath her folded arms. The building changed after dark. The lane lost its visible edges. The walnut branches scratched the side wall with a sound like cautious writing. From the salvage yard came one metallic shift, then the dog's low bark, then silence. The temperature fell quickly. Her breath showed when she held the candle near her face. She ate the last of Mrs. Porter's crackers. Each one softened on her tongue before she swallowed, and drank rainwater caught cleanly from the basin, after straining it through a handkerchief, because thirst had become less negotiable than caution. The 5 senses arranged the place for her more honestly than sight had done. The air tasted of lime dust and iron. The floor smelled of wet pine where rot had begun and dry pine where it had not. The brick wall held cold against her shoulder through the coat. The candle gave off a faint tallow sweetness beneath the sourness of old varnish. In the dark behind the doorway the workshop kept its own smell, paper paste and cedar, a memory of hands. The water continued to mark time in the basin. Tick, tick, tick. She lay awake and listened for danger until listening itself became a kind of company. Once, something small ran inside the wall, paused, then ran back. Once, wind found the cracked front window and made the plastic condemnation sleeve outside snap against the brick. The key rested in her palm under the coat, warming slowly to her skin. A person might have called the room empty. But emptiness, she had learned, made a certain sound. And this was not it. The studio was full of unfinished intention. It held the weight of paper waiting to be soaked, wood waiting to be sanded, lines waiting to be inked, and a silence that was not refusal. The silence was settled, deliberate, almost hospitable, though not yet kind. Near midnight, the clouds parted. Moonlight entered through the broken front pane and lay across the floor in a pale rectangle. It reached the edge of the counter, touched the brass compass without glass, and made the needle shadow point toward the back room. She watched it for a long time. Her body had become too tired to tremble. Her mind loosened, then tightened, then let go in small degrees, just before sleep took her. She heard one last drop fall into the basin in the workshop. tick. The house was patient. So was she. At first light she learned which floorboards would answer her and which ones would lie. The room had cooled until her coat seemed less like clothing than a thin argument against weather. She woke with the key pressed into the crease of her palm and a powdering of plaster dust along one sleeve where the wall had shed during the night. The candle had burned to a shallow cup of wax. In the back room, water still fell at intervals into the metal basin, and the sound had entered her sleep so completely that silence, when it came between drops, felt like a held breath. She did not rise quickly. Ruth's words had become rules, and rules were a form of mercy when a person was alone inside failure. She sat up, put both feet flat on the boards, and tested before standing. The first plank beneath her left heel gave a long complaint but held. The next plank, closer to the room's centre, dipped with a softness she disliked. She marked it with a loose brick, then marked two more the same way before the sun had reached the front windows. By mid-morning, she had made a path from side door to front corner, from front corner to counter, from counter to workshop threshold, from workshop threshold to the basin, but only along the right wall where the boards rang dry underfoot. She moved slowly, stepping, pressing, listening. The building taught in small corrections. A sharp squeal meant an old nail pulling. A hollow thud meant a joist bay beneath. A settled creak meant caution, not danger. Silence meant nothing until tested twice. Outside, she found the well. It was not a true deep well, but an old brick-lined yard pump at the rear of the property, half hidden by dead goldenrod and a fallen length of gutter. The handle was rusted upright. A metal cup hung from a wire hook beside it, its bottom gone to lace. She cleared weeds from the base and worked the handle gently, expecting refusal. For the first minute it gave only a dry scrape, iron against iron, then a cough of brown water, then nothing again. She waited, worked it once more. A second cough came, darker than tea, carrying grit and leaf fragments. She did not drink. She filled a cracked jar from the workshop and set the water aside to settle. By evening the sediment had sunk, leaving a yellowish clarity above it. Still not trustworthy, she boiled none because she had not yet earned fire. For now, rainwater from the basin, strained through cloth, remained safer than the ground's old secrets. The outhouse stood beyond the third walnut tree, weathered to the colour of driftwood, leaning backward into brambles as if withdrawing from its own purpose. The crescent cut in the door had been patched from inside with a shingle. When she opened it, one hinge dropped a screw into the leaves. The pit below was dry and nearly filled with old lime, ash, and the papery remains of wasp nests. There was no dignity in inspecting it, yet dignity had become less useful than sanitation. She cleaned the seat with rainwater and a rag torn from the lining of her dress, then left the door propped open to air. For 3 days, her life narrowed to the practical edge. She woke cold, checked the ceiling, emptied the basin, strained water, cleared broken glass from the front room, carried plaster pieces outside in a crate, and swept without raising clouds when she could. She ate what little she had been given and what she found in kindness. 2 heel ends of bread from a bag placed near the cafe's rear steps, an apple bruised but sound from a produce bin behind St. Anne's, a cup of hot water offered by the woman at Harbour Thread after seeing her cough into her sleeve. She did not ask for charity. People gave as if leaving things for weather. That made it possible to accept. On the third afternoon, the sky lowered into a pewter colour, and wind came hard from the bay. The workshop roof gave a sound she did not like, a lifted rattling near the seam above the giant globe. She dragged the basin farther from the soft boards and climbed onto a low crate to look up, though not high enough to trust anything beneath her full weight. A slate had shifted, not fallen, not yet. The gap showed a sliver of sky and the dark underside of wet roof boards. No fire until the chimney was swept. No ladder until she could borrow one. No roof until she had tools. Tools required money, and money had become nearly absent. She had $4 left from the hidden bills, 16 cents in coins, the deed and the brushes. The brushes could not be sold, not because they were valuable to anyone else, but because they were a surviving language. Selling them would leave her with hands and no alphabet. The next morning, She went to Delaney's Hardware. Ruth was at the front counter repairing the handle of a coal scuttle with wire so neatly twisted that it looked deliberate rather than improvised. The store smelled warmer than the first time, with a pot-bellied stove giving off a steady heat near the nail bins. Its black pipe rose into the ceiling, clean and confident. Snow shovels stood beside sacks of rock salt. A paper Santa had been taped to the register, faded from other Decembers, one corner curling away. Ruth looked up once. You lived. Yes. Ma'am. Roof. Leaking. Chimney. Not touched. Good. Means you listened. Behind Ruth, the store unfolded in aisles of exact need. Pegboards held hand tools with cardboard tags browned by age. A glass case displayed pocket knives, plumb bobs, sharpening stones, awls, and small brass locks. There were drawers of nails sold by the ounce, their handles labelled in careful black marker, and open barrels of kindling broom handles, dowels, and lathe strips. At the far wall, a rack of second-hand tools had been marked, used but honest, in red pencil. Ruth turned the coal scuttle over, inspected the repair, and set it aside. I need to clean a chimney, Lyra said. You need more than that. Yes. Ma'am, you have money? A little. How little? The honest answer came after a pause. $4.16? Ruth did not smile. That was one of the reasons Lyra trusted her. Then we will not insult either of us by pretending you are shopping. Ruth reached beneath the counter and pulled out a ledger bound in cracked black cloth. She opened to a blank page near the back and wrote date, name, property in 3 columns. Her hand was narrow, upright, and without ornament. I can't take credit, Lyra said. Of course you can. The question is whether you will repay it. I will. That was too quick. Lyra lowered her eyes to the ledger. Then I will say it slower. I will repay it. Ruth studied her. The stove clicked softly. Somewhere in the back, a hanging chain swung against metal. Name, Lyra gave it. Ruth's pencil stopped only a fraction of a second at the surname. If she recognized it, she gave the recognition no stage. She wrote the name, the lane, and the word Globeworks in the property column, though no sign outside used that word anymore. Terms, Ruth said. You buy what keeps rain, fire, and sickness from killing you. You do not buy prettiness. You show me the receipt packet when work changes. You pay when paying is possible. If you disappear, I will speak poorly of you to the air. Yes, ma'am. Do not yes, ma'am, a debt. Understand it. I understand. Ruth closed the ledger, then reopened it as if annoyed by her own mercy. Before you ruin my tools, you need to learn what not to do. She reached below the counter again and brought out a spiral-bound manual with a torn cover. Safe repair of old houses. County Extension Service, 1967. The pages were swollen at the corners and marked with grease, pencil, and coffee rings. A child had once drawn a horse on the back. This is free because no one will buy it, Ruth said. Read the chimney chapter twice. Then read the roof section and become frightened in a useful way. The first account listed only necessities. 1 stiff wire chimney brush, 6-inch round. Used 1.25 cents, 20 feet of threaded fiberglass rod. Mismatched sections $1.10. Dust mask. Paper, 3 count 45 cents. Work gloves, second hand, left thumb patched 60 cents. 1 cold chisel. Mushroomed head, ground flat, 75 cents. Masonry brush. Worn but serviceable, 40 cents. 1 pound galvanized roofing nails. Mixed lengths, 55 cents. Half roll tar paper, water stained at the edges, 80 cents. 2 blue tarps with torn corners. Mendable, $1.50. 1 bundle cedar shims, 35 cents. Kerosene lantern without chimney glass, 90 cents. Replacement lantern chimney. Chipped rim, 25 cents. Matches. Credited as county survival. No charge. Ruth wrote prices in the ledger, then drew a line beneath them. That is $8.80, she said. You will not carry all of it today. I can carry the brush and rods. You will carry the manual first. Knowledge weighs less and prevents more funerals. The sentence had no softness in it, but it did not need any. Lyra brought out $2, placed them on the counter, and left the rest of the amount in ink. Ruth accepted the payment without protest, which spared them both embarrassment. Then she wrapped the dust masks and gloves in brown paper, tied the rods with twine, and tucked the manual under the cord. At the door, Ruth called after her, top down. Not bottom up. Lyra turned. The chimney, Ruth said. You clean from the top if you can. If you cannot, you clean from the bottom and let filth fall where it will. But you do not light one match until black stops coming down. Yes, ma'am. And tie cloth over every opening. Creosote travels like gossip. The walk back was difficult with the rods balanced against one shoulder, but the burden felt different from hunger. A tool changes the way distance arranges itself. She entered by the side door, left it open, and read the chimney chapter sitting on the front room floor, with the manual spread on her knees. Then she read it again. The diagrams were simple, almost stern. Flue, smoke shelf, damper, firebox, clean-out cap. Warnings appeared in boxes. Creosote is flammable. Blocked flues kill. Inspect before use. The chimney rose from the back wall, serving a small cast-iron stove she had not yet dared examine. The stove stood half-hidden behind crates near the workshop's rear corner. Squat and black, with nickel trim clouded by rust, its name Starlight No. 22 was cast above the door in raised letters. The pipe entered the brick chimney through a thimble sealed badly with crumbling mortar. Around the stove lay dried leaves, paper scraps, and one mouse nest made from shredded invoice paper. She cleared the area first, then she spread a damp cloth over the stove opening, tied another around the pipe joint, and set the metal basin beneath the clean-out door at the chimney base. There was no safe way onto the roof yet, so she cleaned from below. The first push of the brush met resistance almost immediately. The rods wobbled, the bristles scraped, and a dry black rain fell behind the cloth with a sound like seeds poured into a tin. She withdrew, added a rod, pushed again, twisted clockwise, because the manual warned against unscrewing the sections inside the flue, and worked the brush upward in short strokes. Her shoulders burned by the 10th minute, by the 20th. Sweat had chilled under her shirt, though the room remained near freezing. Creosote came down in flakes, soot, and glossy black curls. Some pieces looked like broken pottery, others were light as ash. The smell was bitter, tarry, and intimate, as if years of unburned smoke had been waiting in the dark to re-enter air. She wore the paper mask, but the taste still reached her tongue. Every half-hour she stopped, carried the basin outside, and emptied it onto a patch of bare ground away from the building. The pile grew black and granular beside the weeds. It took 6 hours the first day. She did not finish. Her arms trembled so badly by late afternoon that she could not keep the rods steady. The brush struck one inner corner again and again without advancing. She marked the height on the rod with a strip of cloth, pulled everything down, and sealed the stove opening for the night. Her face in the cracked mirror behind the counter was streaked black at the cheekbones where the mask had leaked. Her hair smelled of soot. When she coughed, the sound frightened a mouse from behind the shelves. The next morning, she began again before eating. This time she removed the stovepipe. It resisted, then gave suddenly, spilling a dense crescent of soot onto the floor. She cleaned the pipe outdoors with a rag tied to a rod, scraping until daylight showed through its length. The elbow was worse. A bird's nest had lodged near the bend, packed with twigs, straw, thread, and a blue strip of paper from some old envelope. She pulled it out piece by piece with wire, murmuring apology to the absent birds. then set it aside under the walnut tree. Back inside. She opened the chimney clean out fully. The little iron door was rusted at the hinge, but oil and patience persuaded it. Behind it lay a compacted mound of soot and creosote nearly to the lip. She scraped it with the cold chisel, brushed, scraped again, and filled the basin 3 more times. When she pushed the chimney brush upward, after that it travelled farther. Rod by rod, twist by twist, the obstruction loosened. A final shower came down so sudden and heavy that she stepped back, coughing hard into the mask. Then the brush moved freely. She did not trust it. She ran it up and down 10 more times, each stroke smoother than the last. She tied a white scrap of cloth to the rod and sent it up. When it returned, it was grey, not black. She cleaned the firebox, checked the damper, cleared the ash grate, and used a candle near the stove door to test draft. The flame leaned inward toward the flue with a small, obedient pull. Only then did she gather wood. The first fire was not a triumph. It was a negotiation. She used dry splinters from a broken crate, curls of old packing straw, and 1 match. The kindling hesitated, darkened, smoked, then took. The flame crawled along the edge of a pine sliver, found the next, and rose with a modest steadiness. She kept the stove door open a crack and watched the smoke. A little entered the room at first, making her heart tighten, but then the flue warmed and drew cleanly. The stovepipe ticked. The black iron gave off the smell of dust burning away after a long sleep. She fed the fire carefully, phone piece at a time. No roaring. No waste. She had read the manual's warning about thermal shock in old chimneys and obeyed it as if Ruth were standing behind her with folded arms. When the stove top grew warm enough to tremble water in a tin cup, she set the cup there and waited. Steam lifted, thin and nearly invisible. Her first hot meal in the studio was oatmeal from a packet. Ruth had slipped into the hardware bundle without listing it. She cooked it in a dented enamel mug found in the back room, scrubbed with sand and boiled twice. The oats clumped. A bit of soot fell into them from her sleeve. She ate anyway, holding the mug in both hands, letting heat enter her fingers before her mouth. The meal had no sweetness. It was not enough. It was, for that hour, a feast of survival. After the fire, the building changed. Not repaired, not safe, not kind, changed. Warmth moved only a few feet from the stove and vanished into brick and gaps. But where it moved, odours rose. Damp wood, old glue, paper dust, mouse trails, a trace of cedar from the giant globe's ribs. The front windows remained broken. The roof still leaked. The floor still lied in places. Yet the room had accepted flame without killing her. That was a beginning. On the 7th day, she began the inventory. She had delayed because inventory was a form of meeting the dead, and she was not sure whether she had permission, but damp was permission, decay was permission. If objects were not lifted, dried, named and sorted, they would disappear into the same anonymous ruin that had taken her grandfather's things by the pound. She started with the front room. On the counter, ledger, swollen shut, set aside for drying between blotting paper torn from ruined shipping labels, brass compass without glass, 2 bone folders, 1 cracked, tin of map pins, many rusted, 1 inkstone chipped at the corner, wooden awl, 3 empty gum Arabic bottles, porcelain palette with 6 wells, 2 stained blue, 1 green, 1 red, 2 blank, receipt spike, 6 invoices fused by damp, a wooden cash drawer with no cash, only buttons, a postage stamp from 1954, and a pencil sharpened down to a thumb-length point. On the shelves, 4 warped atlas boards, 1 box of student globe bases, 17 metal arcs assorted sizes, 3 jars of dry pigment hardened to stones, 1 bundle of bamboo skewers, 2 cracked magnifying lenses, a shoebox of labels printed in black type, North Pacific Ocean, Equator, Ecliptic, Cape Horn, Providence made by hand, a roll of blue paper too mildewed to save. She wrote everything in a notebook found inside the desk, using a pencil from Ruth. Then the back room. Table 1, parchment scraps, a rusted ruling pen, a glass weight, 2 curved knives wrapped in oilcloth, their blades spotted but sound. Table 2, paste brushes ruined, a jar of wheat starch gone grey, linen strips, a smoothing paddle worn hollow at the centre. Table 3, brass dividers, a small hand drill, a box of tiny screws, a broken pocket watch, 3 photographs stuck face down to the wood. She did not pull them loose yet. Patience, warmth first, humidity slowly. Paper must be asked, not forced. Along the east wall stood shelves of wooden forms. 5 apple-sized spheres, 9 grapefruit-sized, 3 schoolroom models with peeling oceans, 2 celestial globes showing constellations in gold on a dark field, both cracked along the equator, 1 armillary stand missing its rings, a stack of blank gauze cut but never printed, a portfolio case with warped boards, tied shut with cotton tape that snapped when touched. Inside were hand-drawn coastlines, unfinished, beautiful and damaged by silverfish. She laid the salvageable papers on lines she strung across the room. Each sheet went up like laundry from another century. The stove's modest heat moved through them slowly, enough to dry but not enough to curl if she kept them distant. The room became a weather station of paper. Edges lifted, settled, lifted again. Names appeared as they dried: Azores, Labrador, Madeira, Newport Harbour, Greenland Sea, Cape Ann, old ink, made honest by surviving. Near the rear wall, she catalogued crates. Crate A, wooden meridian rings, 7, various diameters. Crate B, chipped plaster moulds, 12. Crate C, oak offcuts, cedar ribs, curved staves, unidentified. Crate D, school globe stands, damaged. Crate E, unmounted hemispheres, papered, no paint. Crate F, cloth sacks of chalk, rabbit skin glue, hide glue pellets, casein powder, most unusable. Then she came to the giant globe. She had avoided it with a respect that was almost superstition. It occupied the room not merely by size, but by intention. A demonstration piece, perhaps, a masterwork interrupted. Its cradle was made of oak, pegged at the joints with 4 wheels and 2 iron brakes frozen in place. The sphere itself was built over a ribbed wooden structure half sealed with layered paper and gesso, half exposed where work had stopped at its equator. A seam ran beneath a raised band. The meridian ring, thick and carefully carved, crossed over the poles and bolted into the cradle. She wrote, "Giant demonstration globe. UN finished. Approx. 6 feet high with cradle. Water darage, lower west side. Meridian ring intact." Then she noticed the sound. At first it was only absence. When she tapped the papered side lightly with a knuckle, it gave a low, dry resonance, as expected from a hollow form. When she tapped the exposed wooden side, the sound changed, deeper near the equator, lighter near the upper ribs. She moved around it, tapping gently every few inches, more from habit learned beside to mash than from suspicion. Listen before correcting, listen before naming. At the lower east quadrant, behind the meridian ring, the sound stopped being hollow. It did not become solid exactly. It became held. She tapped again. Held. 2 inches above. Hollow. 3 inches left. Hollow. Back to the first place. Held. She placed her palm against the area and pressed. No give. She crouched, ignoring the ache in her knees, and examined the surface by candlelight. The paper there had been laid in overlapping strips, not unusual, but the edges formed a subtle oval unlike the surrounding pattern. The gesso had yellowed evenly over it, disguising the difference unless the light crossed low. A person not trained to follow seams would have missed it. A person in a hurry would have destroyed it. She did a weight test next. The globe cradle had 2 iron handles meant for rolling. She released 1 brake with difficulty, cleared debris from the wheels, and pushed. The whole structure resisted, then shifted an inch, groaning into motion. It was heavy everywhere, but not evenly. When she turned it slightly, the lower east quadrant pulled downward, enough that the sphere settled back toward that side when she let go. Not a large difference, a careful one. She found the cedar disc after another hour. It was hidden behind the meridian ring where the degree marks crossed the Southern Ocean, a round plug 6 inches across, stained and painted to match surrounding wood, its grain running at a different angle. Around its edge, nearly invisible beneath dust and old varnish, were 3 tiny wooden pegs. No metal screws, no nail heads. Whoever had made it had meant for it to be opened by someone who knew to look and had time enough not to break what they found. Her hands grew cold. She stepped back and did not touch it for several minutes. The stove made a small settling sound. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches, and the salvage yard dog barked once, not in alarm but in acknowledgement of something passing. The building seemed to hold itself very still around her. She opened the manual to a blank back page and drew the plug, the peg positions, the meridian ring, the grain. Then she sharpened Ruth's pencil with a craft knife and marked measurements. 6 inches diameter, pegs at 12.48, edge sealed with wax or shellac. Access partially blocked by ring, requires removal of lower ring brace. She examined the brace. 2 brass bolts, green with age but not fused. She oiled them and waited. Waiting had become work again. While the oil entered the threads, she made herself sweep the floor. She emptied the basin. She checked the fire. She ate half the remaining bread. She did not let the discovery become frantic. Frantic hands ruin old things. Tomaj had said this without saying it. Each time he took a brush from a child and made her breathe before trying again. At last she returned. The bolts turned with effort, a quarter turn at a time. She used a rag between wrench and brass so the tool would not scar the metal. 1 bolt came free in 20 minutes, the other took nearly an hour. When the lower meridian brace loosened, she did not remove the whole ring. She eased it away from the globe just enough to reach the cedar disc. The pegs resisted. They were tapered, set flush. She used the tip of the awl, then stopped because the wood began to bruise. Instead, she took a sewing needle from her bag, worked dust from the edge, warmed the area with her palm, and pressed gently at each peg in sequence. The first rose less than a fingernail's thickness. Enough. She gripped it with cloth and drew it free. The second followed. The third broke half. She closed her eyes. Not from despair. To slow herself. With the smallest curved knife, she cut around the broken peg, shaving only what the disc would later cover. The remaining wood lifted. She set each piece in order on the table, as though the act of arranging could apologize for damage. The cedar disc did not fall open. It had sealed itself over years. She warmed the edge with a candle held at a distance, not enough to scorch, only enough to soften old wax. Then she slid the bone folder beneath one side and felt the seal release with a soft, reluctant sigh. Behind the disc lay darkness. Not deep darkness, but the kind held inside a box. The opening was lined with cedar. The smell came first, dry, resinous, clean beneath the damp of the room. Her candle revealed brown paper packages tied with cotton tape, stacked tightly inside the globe's hollow core. No glitter, no spectacle, only bundles wrapped by hands that expected time to pass. She did not reach in at once. She sat on the floor beside the globe until her breathing settled. The room around her had become both ordinary and altered. Same leak, same soot under her nails, same cracked windows, same cold entering through every defect. Yet a hidden compartment had opened where there had been only an unfinished world. When she began, she removed the packages one by one. The first was long, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with blue thread. Inside lay tools, 2 sable brushes finer than any she owned, their hairs protected in paper sleeves, a ruling pen with an ivory handle yellowed by age, a pair of brass dividers, a tiny burnisher, and a knife with a curved blade meant for trimming paper gauze along a sphere. Each tool had been cleaned before burial. Each had waited without rust in the cedar dark. The second package held raw material, sheets of linen paper, dry and nearly perfect, a small envelope of gold leaf, 3 paper packets of pigment labelled in a hand she did not know, French ultramarine, burnt sienna, terra verte, a stoppered bottle of gum arabic, crystallized but perhaps salvageable, a folded formula sheet listing paste ratios, 1 part wheat starch, 3 parts water, rest overnight, cook to clear gloss, strain through linen. The third package held a tin box. It was rectangular, biscuit-coloured where the paint remained, with a clasp wrapped in twine and sealed with red wax. She set it on the table. The wax bore the imprint of a compass rose, not stamped cleanly but firmly enough that the design remained. She could have opened it then. Instead, she catalogued the first 2 packages fully, because order was the only fence she had against fear. The 4th package was heavier. Inside was money. She did not understand what she was seeing until she had unfolded the cloth completely. Bills lay in flat bundles sorted by denomination and tied with paper bands gone brown. Some were old series, larger-faced and softer from age. Some were newer to the hand that had wrapped them, though still decades removed from the room in which she sat. There were $20 bills, $10 bills, 5s, 1s, silver certificates, and 2 gold-coloured coins sealed separately in tissue. A second small pouch held coins wrapped in paper, mercury dimes, walking liberty half-dollars, silver quarters, Indian head cents, buffalo nickels worn nearly smooth, and 3 steel pennies dark as rainwater. She stepped away from the table. The money remained there, quiet as folded cloth. For a long while she did nothing. The fire settled in the stove. A coal shifted and sent up a brief red pulse through the grate. Water fell into the basin, not loudly, not softly, just exactly. She looked at the door, she looked at the windows, she looked at the money. Her first act was not to count. It was to close the side door and set the iron key in the lock from inside. Then she counted. Slowly. She made columns in the notebook, large bills first, then smaller, then coins by face value, not collector value, because she did not know and would not guess. She wiped her hands before each bundle. She set each counted group beneath a paperweight. Once she miscounted a stack of 5s and began again from the beginning. Once the wind snapped the condemnation notice against the front brick so loudly that she covered the money with her body before understanding what she had heard. By evening, the total stood at $52,000.43. She wrote the number once. Then she wrote it again beneath the first, because a thing that large beside a life that small demanded verification. $52,000.43. The odd cents came from the pouch, 3 steel pennies, 2 Indian head cents, 1 buffalo nickel, 2 mercury dimes, and 1 silver quarter folded into a paper marked "Keep with medal." Inside the same packet lay a military medal, darkened but carefully wrapped. It was a World War II victory medal, dated by its ribbon and inscription, with 1945 written in pencil on the paper sleeve. The ribbon had faded to muted bands of red, blue, green, yellow, and violet. Beside it was a tiny brass service button and a newspaper clipping so fragile she did not unfold it. At the bottom of the tin box lay a sealed envelope. It was addressed in brown ink. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stared at it until the words ceased being letters and became a voice waiting behind a door. The tin also contained maps. Not printed maps. Hand-drawn sheets on linen, rolled around cedar rods and tied with cotton. She unrolled only the first enough to see the title. Underground Water Notes, Fox Point and Adjoining Plats. 1931-1959. The lines were not roads alone. They showed wells, springs, seepage veins, old cisterns, aquifer marks, and blue threads beneath streets where no surface water appeared. Several parcels were marked with careful symbols. Some notes referred to mineral taste, pressure, seasonal rise, and purity tests. One margin read, "Whole town stands above a patient river no one sees." She stopped unrolling. The room had become too full. Money, medal, maps, tools, materials, letter. Each one asked for a different kind of attention, and she did not yet trust herself to give any of them what they deserved. Hunger urged her toward the money. Fear urged her to hide it again. Loneliness urged her toward the letter. Craft urged her toward the tools. Survival urged her toward the roof. She did none of these. She repacked the bills into the cloth, placed the coins and medal back in the tin, set the envelope on top without breaking its seal, then returned everything except the tools and one formula sheet to the cedar compartment. The broken peg she wrapped separately. She fitted the cedar disc back loosely, not sealed, and drew the meridian brace into place without tightening the bolts fully. Enough to hide the opening from a casual glance, not enough to pretend nothing had happened. Then she took the lantern, the envelope, and the medal packet to the front room. She sat beside the cold window until darkness erased the lane. The letter lay on her lap, addressed to no name, and therefore perhaps to every person who had ever arrived empty enough to listen. She ran one thumb over the sealed flap. The paper had browned at the edges, the ink remained legible. Someone had written those words while imagining a stranger or a descendant or a hand not yet born. She did not open it that night. Instead, she put on her coat and went outside. The air had cleared after rain, and the cold entered her lungs with a clean edge. Beyond the salvage yard, beyond the warehouses and the broken pavement, the harbour lay hidden but present, its smell travelling through gaps in the city, salt, mud, rope, diesel, and the metallic breath of tide. She walked past the walnut trees to the rear of the property, where the ground sloped toward a marshy strip choked with reeds. Water moved there, not much, only a black ribbon between grasses, but it caught the moon and carried it in broken pieces. She stood watching until her feet began to ache from stillness. The maps inside the globe had marked water below land, hidden veins beneath ordinary lots, patient pressure under streets people crossed without knowing what held them. She thought of all the things that could move unseen through a town: grief, debt, kindness, greed, craft, hunger, inheritance. She thought of Tomasz repairing islands no one had paid him to paint. She thought of the county clerk's crackers, Ruth's ledger, the church custodian touching the pew instead of her shoulder, the woman with clementines, and the librarian who had offered scrap paper. None of it resembled rescue when it happened. It was too small for that word. Yet small things had made a path: a cup of water, a pencil, a warning, a bottle of oil, a free manual, a door opening 1 inch, a key turning only after waiting. If she had missed any one of them, the cedar disc might have remained hidden until demolition broke the globe into splinters and scattered the secret among brick dust. She stayed outside until the cold worked through her shoes. When she returned, the stove held only embers. She did not add wood. The room had enough light from the lantern to show the envelope where she had left it, and enough darkness to let it remain unread. She folded her coat beneath her head, placed the medal packet and the tools inside the brush box, and laid the sealed letter flat beneath both hands. The building settled around her. Above, the roof still leaked. Behind her, the globe held its replaced silence, altered but not emptied. Under the floor, a mouse resumed its cautious passage through the wall. Far off, the salvage yard dog barked twice and stopped. The world had not become safe. It had become entrusted. The house was patient. So was she. Morning entered through the broken window with a colour like pewter rubbed thin. Lyra woke before the street did, before the salvage yard radio, before the dog's first bark, before any truck turned into the lane and shook the wet ground. The letter was still under her hands. Sometime during the night her fingers had curled over its edges, not crushing it, only keeping it from being taken by the dark. Her palms had warmed the paper enough that when she lifted them, the envelope held the faintest shape of her touch. She did not open it on the floor. Some things ask a body to rise. She rekindled the stove with kindling shaved from a broken crate, fed it slowly, and waited until the iron began to speak in small ticks. Then she washed her hands in rainwater, cold enough to narrow the skin, and dried them on the least stained corner of her handkerchief. The front room had no table steady enough, so she carried the letter into the back workshop to the long door laid across trestles that reminded her so sharply of Tomasz's room that she had to stand still before approaching it. Light from the high windows fell across the surface in grey bands. She placed the envelope there and turned it over. The flap had been sealed with plain glue, not wax. Time had browned the fold and loosened one corner. The handwriting across the front was slanted, narrow, and deliberate, with the downstrokes heavier than the curves. It was not Tomash's hand. She knew that immediately, with the certainty of a person who had studied absence by studying what remained. Yet something in the careful spacing, the disciplined patience between words, carried the same blood of attention. "My dear one, whoever you are." She slid the thinnest knife under the loosened corner and opened the envelope along its old seam. Inside were 8 folded sheets, written on both sides in brown-black ink. The pages had been folded twice, then kept so long in cedar darkness that the creases had become part of their architecture. She unfolded them carefully and weighted the corners with a brass divider, the chipped inkstone, a jar of dried pigment, and the military medal still in its paper sleeve. Then she read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has found your hands, then either my blood has lasted longer than my certainty, or mercy has chosen a stranger more faithfully than family would have done. I am writing from a narrow bed in Providence Hospital, under the care of Dr. Nathaniel Carr, who told me on the morning of October 3rd, 1961, that the trouble in my lungs has gone beyond cutting and beyond prayer of the ordinary sort. He did not say death, because kind men sometimes avoid plain words when a woman is sitting upright and looking directly at them. But I have drawn enough coastlines to recognize the shape of an ending. My name is Miriam Bellamy Maren. I was born in 1890 in this very building, before the side door swelled, before the third walnut split at the crown, before the city forgot that careful hands once worked beside the harbour. My father was Elias Bellamy, born 1858 in Providence, son of Mercy Wetherell Bellamy, born 1831 in Bristol, who learned paper casting from her mother, Annalise Voss, born 1804 near Haarlem, and brought here as a child with 2 wooden moulds and a recipe for paste written in Dutch. My mother was Celia Duarte Bellamy, born 1862 in New Bedford, daughter of a Cape Verdean sailmaker and a seamstress who could mend canvas in a gale without dropping her needle. That is 4 generations if you count me, and perhaps more if you count the hands that taught our hands without leaving names. We made school globes, harbour globes, celestial spheres for libraries, and corrected charts for men who believed the sea began only when they saw it. Our work was never grand, though a few of the larger pieces travelled farther than any of us. We pasted paper over plaster and wood, sanded with pumice, laid gesso in thin coats, mixed colour from mineral and gum, and drew shorelines under magnifying glass until our backs ached and our eyes watered. We wrote names in black so small that children in distant classrooms could place one finger on a town and feel that the world had admitted them. The trade ended here on September 21st, 1938, the day the hurricane came up the bay. By noon, the water had already left its rightful places. By afternoon, boats were in streets, windows had become doors for the wind, and the roof above the workshop lifted like a hand trying to wave down heaven. My husband, Abram Maren, and my brother Joseph Bellamy tied ropes around their waists and crossed the lane to pull Mrs. Pell and her 2 little boys from the lower salvage shed. They brought them back alive. The next gust took the south roof seam and half our drying racks. The flood entered from the rear and carried away paper, moulds, ledgers, and 6 finished school globes waiting for delivery to Worcester. We saved what we could by lamplight after the water fell, but something in the shop had changed. Not only the building, the faith of it. After that came years of repair without recovery. Abram found war work in instrument casings. Joseph went north. My son Daniel, who had the steadiest hand of us all, enlisted after Pearl Harbor and was sent to Europe. He came home in 1945 with a medal, a cough, and eyes that no longer rested on any object for long. He died in 1949 at the Veterans Hospital in Brockton of an infection that began with lungs weakened in winter service. Abram followed him in 1952, not suddenly, but by the slow departure of a man who has outlived the table he meant to keep filled. Joseph was lost before that, in the Argonne in the Great War, October 1918, though we did not receive confirmation until the following spring. I have known the silence after men do not return, and I do not recommend making a shrine of it. Shrines gather dust, Work gathers breath. For more than 30 years I have kept this place closed to all but weather, memory, and the occasional rat with ambition. I did not close it from anger. I closed it because every person who wanted it wanted either the bricks or the land, and every person who might have loved it had died, scattered, or learned to be practical. Practicality is a useful coat, but it is poor shelter for inheritance. I paid the taxes when I could. When I could not, I hid what mattered where demolition men would not look gently. If you have opened the cedar disc, you have already shown more patience than greed. If you broke it, forgive yourself only after repairing it. The money is not a fortune, though it may appear so, if you have arrived with empty pockets. It is the saved trade, payments tucked aside, war bonds cashed and never spent, widows' coins, rent, I refuse to pay myself, repair money, grief money, and one envelope of bills Daniel sent home before he understood that war changes the value of returning. Spend it like roof beams, not fireworks. Spend it where water enters, where heat escapes, where tools can be made honest again. If hunger brought you here, eat first, but do not let hunger become a landlord inside you. The maps are more dangerous than the money because men with clean fingernails will know how to make them sound public while using them privately. They show underground water veins, old wells, cistern cuts, and marsh-fed channels beneath Fox Point and beyond. My father recorded them from builders, diggers, pump men, sailors, and women who knew which cellar stones wept in August. Do not sell them quickly, do not show them widely. Water belongs to the living more than to the clever. Now for the work, because sentiment without instruction is only perfume. For paste, use 1 part wheat starch by weight to 3 parts clean water. Soak overnight. Warm over low heat and stir without stopping until the mixture turns translucent and pulls in ribbons from the spoon. Do not let it boil hard. Strain through linen while warm. For papier-mâché over wood, lay the first strips with the grain crossing the ribs, the second layer diagonally, the third with the intended gore line. Let each layer dry at least 12 hours in air, no colder than 58 degrees, no hotter than 72, with no stove blast directly upon it. If you rush the drying, the paper remembers and lifts later. For gesso, sift chalk twice, 2 parts chalk, 1 part hide glue size, a spoon of zinc white if you have it, no more. Warm to 110 degrees. If it smells scorched, throw it away and begin again. Lay thin coats with a soft brush, 6 coats for a globe handled by children, 8 for one meant to endure. Sand with pumice between every second coat. Your hand should feel the floor before your eye is proud enough to find it. For color, grind mineral pigments on marble with gum arabic until the sound changes from sand to cream. Verdigris is treacherous. Use sparingly and seal it well. Ultramarine likes patience. Iron red stains the fingers and forgives poor paper less than any other. Paint oceans in 2 washes, never one, and keep the second wash wetter at the equator if you wish the sphere to carry light. Letter only after the varnish has rested. A name written too soon will sink and blur, and then the place has been wronged. For varnish, use shellac cut thin. 3-pound cut reduced by half with alcohol for the first coat. Dust will find you. It always does. Do not curse it. Remove what you can with a tack cloth and accept that the world enters every object made within it. If you are of my family, know that you were not abandoned by the work. You were separated from it by death, weather, fear, and the particular cowardice of people who call destruction efficient. If you are not of my family and still you have reached this table with care, then perhaps family is not the narrow bridge I was taught to guard. Perhaps inheritance is anything kept long enough for the right hunger to become reverence. I have hidden tools because tools are prayers with handles. I have hidden money because roofs require more than courage. I have hidden maps because water, like grief, travels beneath names. I have hidden this letter because I could not bear the thought of the house being called empty by people who never listened at its walls. When you go outside, look to the second walnut, the one nearest the side door, about shoulder height on the lane side. You will find an old horseshoe grown into the bark. My father nailed it there the summer I turned 12, after I bent my first meridian ring without snapping it. He said luck should be fastened where working hands pass each day, not hung over a parlour door for guests. Touch it once for those before you, then leave it be. If the blue candle wrapped with the tools has survived, light it when you are ready to promise the house one honest repair. Not all of them. Do not make promises so large they become lies. One repair will do. Houses trust slowly, and so should people. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Miriam Bellamy Maren, November 14th, 1961. Lyra read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again, slower, her finger following the lines the way she had followed coastlines as a child. The stove ticked behind her. Water struck the basin. A strip of damp paper near the ceiling lifted in a draught and settled back. When she reached the signature the second time, she did not speak the name aloud. The room had already heard it. She folded the sheets along their original creases. Not new folds, not hurried folds. She let the old lines guide her hands until the letter became again the shape it had held in darkness for decades. Then she placed it back inside the envelope, but did not seal it. Some doors, once opened properly, should not be made to pretend they were still closed. Outside, the cold had sharpened. She went through the side door and stood beneath the second walnut. In daylight, the tree looked larger than it had on the first approach. Its trunk divided into a heavy fork above her head, its bark ridged deeply enough to hold rainwater in the grooves. She walked around to the lane side, brushing dead grapevine away with one hand. At shoulder height, almost swallowed by the living wood, was the horseshoe. The walnut had grown around the iron so slowly that bark curled over both ends like closed fingers. Only the curve remained clear, rusted, pitted, dark with weather, but unmistakable. A nail head showed at one side, half buried. She touched the iron with 2 fingers. It was colder than the air. She did not pray. Prayer had become for her a language other people spoke fluently in rooms where she felt clumsy. Instead, she stood with her fingers against the horseshoe until the cold entered her skin and left a small ache there. The tree gave nothing back that could be named. Still, the gesture completed something the letter had asked of her, and completion, even modest completion, steadied the morning. Under the walnut, the ground was scattered with black shells and leaf stems. Beyond the lane, the salvage yard dog watched from his fence, seated now, ears forward. When she lowered her hand from the horseshoe, he stood, shook himself once, and turned away, as if a record had been updated. Back inside, she searched the cedar compartment again. The blue candle was wrapped with the heirloom tools thinner than she expected, no longer blue exactly, but the faded colour of a winter sky seen through smoke. It had been rolled in waxed paper with a handwritten band around it, for first repair promised. The wick had yellowed. The wax held a fine bloom from age. She carried it to the front room with both hands, though it weighed almost nothing. Choosing the promise took longer than lighting the candle. The roof called first because water had authority. The chimney argued because fire had risk. The windows spoke through every draught. The wall leaned with a patience that frightened her most of all. She could not promise restoration. She could not promise beauty. She could not promise reopening, lineage, honour, or any of the grand words that make a person feel briefly larger than her means. She promised the leak above the basin. One honest repair. She set the candle in the cracked porcelain palette between the blue-stained well and the red one. She struck a match from Ruth's box, sheltered the flame with her palm, and held it to the old wick. For several seconds nothing happened. The wax softened, darkened, and released a smell unlike the fresh candles from church altars or grocery aisles. It smelled faintly of beeswax, cedar, and closed drawers. Then a small flame stood. Not bright, not ceremonial, simply present. Its light touched the compass without glass, the swollen ledger, the letter lying open beside the brush box, and the 12 old brushes that had crossed from one life into another by the narrow mercy of being overlooked. Lyra sat before it until the flame steadied. Her hands rested on her knees, palms upward, soot still in the lines of them. That was when the small kindnesses returned, one by one, not as thoughts but as objects. The church custodian's paper cup of water, left on the pew rail without sermon, the woman outside the warehouse pressing clementines into her palm and not waiting to be thanked, Miriam, the librarian tearing a blank corner from a checkout slip as though scrap paper were ordinary grace, Mrs. Porter's crackers and machine oil, made official by no stamp, Ruth Delaney's manual, ledger and severe instruction that had kept smoke from filling the room, the woman at Harbour Thread opening the door only long enough to pass out hot water in a measuring cup, then closing it before embarrassment could enter. None had rescued her. That was the honest part. They had not lifted her out of ruin, paid her debts, restored her mother, returned Tomasz's lost trunk, or made the stepfather's house answer for what it had done. They had done smaller things, exact things, things a person could offer without pretending to own the outcome. A cup, a fruit, a pencil, oil, a warning, heat enough for 10 swallowed mouthfuls, the kind of care that does not announce itself often leaves the deepest mark. And maybe you have one of those moments too. Maybe someone once handed you a sandwich in a parking lot, or sat beside you in a hospital corridor without asking you to explain, or fixed a tire in the rain, or mailed back a photograph you thought was gone, or said one plain sentence that helped you live through an hour no one else knew was dangerous. If you remember it, write it below. Not the grandest kindness, the small one, the one that arrived quietly and stayed. The candle burned lower. Lyra did not move until wax had pooled in the porcelain well and the flame leaned, recovered, then leaned again. When it finally went out, it did so without drama, leaving a thread of smoke that lifted straight for a moment before dissolving into the colder air above the table. She kept the cooled remnant, not as a relic, as evidence of a promise. That night, she prepared the room differently. The money went back into the cedar compartment, wrapped and hidden. The maps returned there too, rolled exactly as she had found them, though the first one remained in her mind with its blue underground lines. The letter she placed inside the brushbox beneath Tomasz's note, not because one belonged above the other, but because both had been written toward a future neither writer could control. The medal, still wrapped, lay beside the box. The heirloom tools she did not return to darkness. She cleaned a shelf in the front room, wiped it with a damp rag, dried it near the stove and laid the tools there on a folded cloth, ruling pen, dividers, burnisher, curved knife, the 2 fine brushes still wearing their paper sleeves. They looked too delicate for the ruined room, yet somehow the room became less ruined by holding them. Before sleeping she checked the stove twice, cleared ash from the door and banked the coals small. She set the manual beside her head and the iron key under her coat. Outside the wind had dropped. The lane was still. The walnut branches no longer scratched the wall, and the silence that remained felt less like vacancy than watchfulness. She lay on the boards in the front room with the brush box against her side and the heirlooms within reach of her hand. Above her, water still found its path through the roof. Behind her, the giant globe held its cedar secret in the dark. Beside her, the letter rested with its final words no longer hidden from the air. The house is not empty. She did not say it aloud. She slept. The first snow came on December 6th, not as a storm, but as a correction. By dawn, 3 inches lay on the lane, the walnut branches, the salvage yard fence, and the ruined roof whose openings had been dark accusations for too long. Snow softened the broken glass in the front windows and gathered along the bowed sill of the side door. It covered the Orange County notice until only the lower corner showed, a small square of official color beneath the white. Inside, the studio held cold the way brick holds memory. Lyra woke to a room so still her breath seemed loud. The stove had burned low in the night, leaving only a red seam under ash. She fed it slowly, then carried the metal basin from the workshop where the roof leak had continued even through snow, drop by drop, because meltwater knew the same path rain had known. She stood beneath the seam above the giant globe and looked up. One honest repair. The promise had become smaller by daylight and larger by consequence. A roof was not a patch of sentiment. It was angle, weight, fastener, overlap, load, weather, and nerve. She took Ruth's county manual from the front room, opened to the roof section, and read it beside the stove with her knees drawn under her coat. Then she read it again. Then a third time aloud in places, not because sound improved the instructions, but because hearing the warnings made them harder to ignore. Do not work on wet slate, do not step between rafters, do not assume old sheathing holds, establish ladder angle at 1 foot out for every 4 feet of rise. Tee off where possible, do not roof alone if avoidable. That last line she underlined with a pencil so hard the point broke. By mid-morning she had measured what she could from below. The workshop roof plane above the leak ran roughly 28 feet long and 18 feet from ridge to eave. The worst failure covered a section about 6 feet by 9 feet near the rear slope, where slate had slipped, sheathing had opened, and tar paper from some later repair had rotted into black lace. The manual's diagrams asked for square footage. She gave them numbers as carefully as if a wrong sum might let more weather in. 6 by 9. 54 square feet damaged. Add overlap. Add waste. Add fear. At Delaney's, Ruth listened while Lyra explained the measurements, not interrupting until the pencil reached the bottom of the brown paper sheet. "You are not replacing the roof," Ruth said. "No." "Ma'am." "You are making it stop bleeding through winter." "Yes." "Ma'am." "That sentence you understand?" Ruth pulled stock from corners that paying customers had ignored. 2 bundles of asphalt shingles, mismatched grey and green but sound, each covering about 33 square feet if laid by someone who did not waste them. Half a roll of 15-pound felt, enough if the cuts were exact. Galvanized roofing nails 1 1/4 inch from an open box sold by weight. A small tin of roof cement with a dented lid. 2 lengths of scrap flashing, a chalk line, its blue powder nearly gone, a cat's paw nail puller with a cracked handle wrapped in electrical tape, a handsaw sharpened too many times, 3 8-foot 2x4s, not pretty, but straight enough to sister weak rafters if rot had not travelled beyond reach. Ruth wrote each item in the ledger, slower than usual. Shingles, 2 partial bundles, $4. Felt, $1. Nails, 60 cents. Cement, 75. Flashing, no charge because it offends me. Chalk line, deposit. Saw, borrowed. Cat's paw, borrowed. Lumber, $3. Lyra did not speak. The numbers had already passed what she could imagine repaying soon, but Ruth kept writing as though debt could be made less frightening by being exact. From behind the stove, Ruth brought out a hatchet. It was short-handled, dark, and narrow at the blade, with a notch near the pole and a leather wrap so worn that the grip had taken the shape of fingers long gone. She laid it on the counter separately from the account. "My brother used this on roofs before his knees quit him," she said. "He died in March. It is not for sale." Lyra stepped back half a pace. "I can't take that." "You are not taking. You are carrying it until the work is done. I don't know how to use it. You will not use it until Samuel tells you." The name arrived before the man did. Samuel Pike came into the hardware store while Ruth was tying the shingles with cord, bringing cold air, pipe tobacco smell, and the faint medicinal sharpness of wintergreen liniment. He was tall once, and still tall in the bones, though age had folded him forward from the upper back. His beard was white and trimmed close. One eye watered in the cold. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows and a knit cap pulled low, and he carried himself with the practiced irritation of a man whose body had become slower than his judgment. "This her?" he asked Ruth. "This is her." Samuel looked at Lyra's shoes first, then her hands, then the bundle of roof materials. "You got gloves?" "Yes." "Sir?" "Good ones?" "No." "Sir?" That was the right answer. Ruth opened her mouth. Samuel lifted one finger. "I am not taking pay," he said. Lyra had not offered. The refusal still found her. "I can help," she said. "You had better. I am too old to roof for somebody watching from the ground." He came that afternoon to see the building before agreeing to step on it. He walked the lane slowly, tested the ladder Ruth had arranged to borrow from the feed supplier, looked at the roof from the front, the side, the rear, and then stood beneath the workshop leak with his cap in his hands. He said little terse men. Lyra was learning often gave their kindness the shape of inconvenience. "Rafters tired," he said, pointing up. "Yes, sir." "That seam's open." "Yes, sir." Slate below it shifted. "Yes, sir." "Stop saying yes if you do not see it." She looked again. The rafter near the leak bowed slightly where dark staining had followed water. The seam had opened along the old patch, not through the original slate. Below the split, 2 courses had slid just enough to leave a line. She saw it then. "I see it. Better." They worked 11 days, not all in a row, because weather ruled more sternly than any person. Samuel began by teaching the ladder, 1 foot out for every 4 feet up, feet planted, top tied with rope, not trusted to good intentions, 3 points of contact, tools carried in a bucket, not hands, never step where you have not tested, never place faith in boards you did not inspect from below. He spoke in fragments because roofs, he said, did not reward speeches. On the first day they cleared snow from the lower roof with brooms tied to long handles, then waited until sun and wind dried enough of the patch to begin. The air stayed below freezing, but the roof surface warmed slightly in noon light. Samuel went first, light-footed in spite of age. Lyra followed only as far as the staging plank he had fixed across 2 sound areas, her body stiff with the knowledge of height. "Look at the work," he said. Not the ground. She looked at the slate, the broken tar, the nail heads, the water path. Better. The damaged rafter was worse than it had seemed from below, but not ruined end to end. Samuel made her scrape softened wood with the awl until clean fibre appeared. Then they cut one of Ruth's 2x4s to length and sistered it beside the old rafter, fastening it with 16-penny galvanized nails driven in a staggered pattern. Samuel showed her how to set the first nail, how to start without splitting, how to keep the board tight while he held pressure from the far side. 3 strokes, he said. She frowned. Set. Drive. Seat. He demonstrated. 1 light strike to set the nail. 1 deliberate stroke to drive. 1 exact final strike to seat the head flush. Not buried. Her first attempt left the head high. That nail's proud. She reached for the hammer again. Pull it. She pulled it. The second bent. Pull it. The third split the edge of the patchboard. Too near. Pull it. By the 4th, her arm shook from the cold and the work, but the nail seated clean. Samuel tapped beside it with 2 fingers. That one stays. The praise was so small it entered deeper than a larger thing would have done. They snapped a chalk line across the repair area. Blue dust, faint against grey felt and dark old slate. Samuel made her hold one end. Pull tight. Lift. Release. The line struck straight, leaving a mark that made the roof legible. Old roof edges lie to tired eyes, he told her. Chalk is less sentimental. They removed broken patching with the cat's paw, salvaged every slate that could be set aside, laid felt under the exposed area, and slid flashing where water had been finding the seam. Her fingers grew clumsy inside the patched gloves. Every hour she climbed down, warmed them near the stove, and climbed up again. Samuel did not hurry her. He only said, "Cold hands miss." Day by day. The wound changed shape. First open, then squared, then reinforced, then felted, then shingled in careful overlapping courses, not beautiful because the colours disagreed, but tight enough to shed winter. Samuel made her stagger the joints. He made her check the exposure with a scrap of wood marked 5 inches. He made her lift each upper edge and dab roof cement where the old surface would not lie flat. When she grew tired enough to become careless, he climbed down without explanation, and the day's work ended. On the 9th day, snow threatened again. They worked until the light failed, fastening the last upper course beneath a row of original slate. Samuel's breath came hard by then, and twice he stood with one hand against the chimney, not leaning exactly, only negotiating with his lungs. Lyra pretended not to see because he had pretended not to see her fear on the ladder. On the 11th day, in the thin light of mid-December, they poured a bucket of water slowly above the repair. Inside, no drop fell into the basin. They waited. Still none. Samuel looked at the dry metal bottom, then at the ceiling, then at Lyra. "Roof keeps," he said. That was all. January taught her that brick can fail quietly for years before anyone hears it. The test fire after the roof patch had made the studio bearable, but the chimney remained a question with soot-black answers. Once the worst leak no longer fed the workshop floor, Lyra began inspecting the masonry with the manual open on a crate beside her. The bricks around the thimble had begun to spall, their faces flaking away in thin orange scales. Mortar had powdered between joints near the base. When she pressed a finger against one seam, it came away gritty, pale, and useless. Ruth called it thirst. "Brick takes water," she said, setting 2 chipped fire bricks on the hardware counter for demonstration. Then frost opens it. Then heat insults it. Then people act surprised. The repair would not be grand. The chimney did not need rebuilding that winter, Samuel said after looking it over with one eye narrowed. It needed respect, repointing, and enough sound mortar around the thimble to keep flame where flame belonged. So January became mortar. Ruth sold her materials in the smallest useful quantities and wrote them in the ledger with unusual care. Hydraulic lime, £2.70. Washed sharp sand, 1 small sack. 85. Fire clay, £1.60. Stiff bristle brush, used, 25. Pointing trowel borrowed. Joint raker borrowed canvas drop cloth with paint stains, no charge, because rats had chewed one corner and Ruth took offence at selling what rats had edited. The mix for ordinary joints was 2 parts sharp sand to 1 part hydraulic lime, dampened slowly until it held on the trowel without slumping. Around the thimble, where heat worked harder, Ruth instructed a different recipe: 2 parts fire clay, 1 part lime, 1 part fine sand, mixed in small batches because impatience made it crack. "Do not smear," Ruth said. "No." "Ma'am." "Pack." "Yes." "Ma'am." And missed the old brick first. "Dry brick steals water from new mortar." "Yes." "Ma'am." Ruth stopped writing. "You're doing it again." "I am listening." "Then say what I said." Lyra repeated it. "Missed the brick. Pack the joint. Small batches. No fire until cure had begun. Keep freezing air off the fresh work if possible." Ruth nodded and added 1 old spray bottle to the pile without writing a price. The work took 3 weeks because winter would not step aside for a poor woman with a trowel. Most mornings stayed in the 20s. The front room hovered near 30 degrees until the stove had run long enough to persuade only the air nearest it. She could not make the room too hot while working fresh mortar, and she could not let the mortar freeze. So she worked in short, controlled hours, hanging a canvas curtain between workshop and front room, warming water just enough, and building small fires only after covering new joints with damp burlap and then with old blankets held away from flame. The first step was removal. She raked out loose mortar to a depth of twice the joint width, as the manual instructed, careful not to widen sound joints, simply because her hands wished for uniformity. The bad material fell in pale powder. Some joints gave up easily, others held hard and honest, refusing disturbance. She learned the difference by feel. Rotten mortar scratched out like old sugar. Sound mortar resisted with a mineral scrape. She brushed each joint clean, vacuumed dust with a hand broom and tin pan, then misted the brick until it darkened but did not shine. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. At first, she tried to continue through it. That led to dropped tools, smeared joints, and one bleeding knuckle she did not notice until red mixed with grey on the trowel. After that, she obeyed the clock inside her fingers. Work 15, warm them near the stove, flex each joint, return. There was no romance in it, only repetition. On the 5th day, she packed the first line joint badly. Too wet. It sagged from the seam and left a smear across the brick face. She scraped it out, cleaned the stain with a brush, and began again with a drier batch. The second held. She struck the joint with the edge of the trowel, not too deep, matching the old recess profile. When it firmed, she brushed lightly across it to remove crumbs and expose sand. It looked modest. It looked right. Near the thimble. The work grew more careful. Old mortar there had cracked into a dark ring where the stovepipe entered the chimney. She removed it a little at a time, conscious of the pipe, the brick, the fire's future path. Fireclay mix felt different under the trowel, smoother and more stubborn. She pressed it in layers, thumb-width by thumb-width, packing behind the visible edge, then smoothing the surface only after she was sure no pocket remained. Pockets held air. Air invited heat. Heat found weakness. By the 2nd week, her shoulders ached from crouching and reaching. Lime dried the skin along her fingers until it split near the nails. She rubbed them with a little cooking oil Doris from the cafe had given her in a folded paper cup, then wrapped the worst cracks with strips of cloth before sleeping. The room smelled of damp mortar, ash, old brick and wool drying too near the stove. Samuel came twice. He said little. As always, the first time, he pressed one new joint with a thumbnail and grunted. Too soon for fire. I know. Know it tomorrow, too. The second time, he crouched by the thimble, looked at the packed fireclay, and nodded once. Won't shame you. That was his way of saying the work would hold. Late in January, on a day when the temperature rose above freezing and sunlight lay briefly across the front floor, Lyra made the test fire. She had waited a full week after the last joint near the heat path, longer than the manual demanded, because fear had become useful when it stayed obedient. She began with paper, then kindling, then 2 small pieces of hardwood. The stove smoked at first not into the room but along the pipe as dust and old odour warmed. The draught took. She watched the thimble. No smoke leaked. She watched the clean outdoor. No dark line appeared. She went outside and stood in the lane looking up. Smoke rose from the chimney in a narrow grey column. No roll. No backwash. No sour downward drift. It went clean. The salvage yard dog came to the fence and watched beside her. The smoke climbed into the pale winter sky until the wind took it east. Toward the harbour, Lyra stood there with her cracked hands under her arms. Feeling heat exist behind brick, she had repaired one joint at a time. When she went back inside, the stove was ticking steadily. The studio smelled less abandoned that evening. Not restored, not safe in every corner, but less surrendered. The floors had been waiting under dirt, plaster, soot, and weather. Once the chimney drew clean and the roof patch held through 2 rains, Lyra could look downward instead of upward without feeling negligent. The front room boards were white pine, wide and hand-planed, their surfaces cupped by damp and worn into shallow valleys where feet had crossed for generations. Some planks were 12 inches across, some were narrower replacement boards from another era. Their nails were hand-cut rose heads in the older sections, square-shanked and dark, set unevenly but with purpose. She learned to read them by kneeling. The places near the front door held grit ground into the grain. Behind the counter the boards were smoother, polished by standing work. Near the broken window water had blackened 2 planks beyond saving at the ends. But Samuel told her the joist beneath remained sound after he tested it with an awl. The workshop floor would have to wait. The front room could be made clean enough to live in without ruining what remained. Ruth rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. It was heavy yellow and loud enough to make the room forget every gentle sound it had learned. The rental came with conditions. Keep the cord over your shoulder. Start with the pad on the floor, not in the air. Do not tip the edge. Do not linger or you will dish the pine. Wear the mask. Vacuum dust before changing grits. Return it with the bag emptied, or Ruth would charge annoyance as labour. The sanding paper cost extra. 3 discs of 80 grit. 3 of 120. 3 of 220. Ruth wrote each price in the ledger, then crossed out 2 discs and added them from a drawer of mismatched stock. Old pine gums paper, she said. The floor will not care if the brand matches. Lyra cleared the room the night before. She moved the brush box, the letter, the heirloom tools, the manual and the surviving papers into the back workshop on the driest shelf. She carried plaster rubble outside, stacked loose boards, pulled remaining carpet tacks from one corner with the cat's paw, and marked the soft places with chalk. Every nail head had to be set below the surface, so she spent hours with a nail set and hammer, tapping rosehead nails just enough, never burying them beyond history. The sound changed when each nail seated, sharp then dull, proud then level. The first pass with 80 grit began after sunrise. The sander bucked once, then settled into its circular labour. Dust lifted in a pale cloud despite the bag. Beneath grey dirt the floor emerged not new but legible. Old stains remained and she was glad. A floor with no memory would have looked false in that room. The 80 grit removed splinters, grime, raised grain, and the shallow scars of dragged furniture. It also revealed darker paths, amber near the counter, brown near the stove, almost black by the window where weather had entered. She moved slowly with the grain, overlapping each pass. When her arms tired, the sander began to wander. She stopped before it could punish the wood for her exhaustion. The machine filled the room with a hard mechanical whine that left her ears ringing long after she unplugged it. Between passes, she swept, vacuumed with a borrowed shop vac from Delaney's, wiped dust from the sill, and opened the side door for air even though cold entered fiercely. The 120 grit softened what the 80 had made plain. The boards no longer caught at her rag. The grain began to show, long pale lines, knots like closed eyes, dark mineral streaks where old sap had hardened. The workshop beyond remained rough, but the front room brightened by degrees. She worked until dusk, returned the sander late with apologies, and paid Ruth only the rental deposit she had been told to bring. "Need it tomorrow?" Ruth asked. "Yes." "Ma'am, then take it back." 14 covers 24 hours. Use all 24 if your arms can. Her arms could not. Her will tried. The 220 pass happened the next morning, quieter, in effect though not in sound. It did not change the room dramatically, it refined. That was its virtue. The floor took on a dry, smooth feel beneath her palm, no longer splintered but still uneven, still hand-worn, still itself. After the final sweep, she knelt and ran both hands across the boards from the front door toward the counter. Dust clung to the cracks in her skin. The wood felt like something rescued without being disguised. Finish was another lesson. Ruth refused polyurethane before Lyra had even asked. That floor breathed before your grandmother's grandmother was born. Do not wrap it in plastic. They chose a mixture of tung oil and boiled linseed oil, thinned for the first coat so it would enter the wood rather than sit smugly atop it. Ruth measured the first batch in an old coffee can, 2 parts tung oil, 1 part boiled linseed, 1 part mineral spirits. Apply thin. Wipe excess after 30 minutes. Hang oily rags outside flat, never in a pile, unless burning down the building had become part of the plan. The first coat turned the white pine dark honey. Lyra worked on her knees with a cloth wrapped around her hand, rubbing the oil in circles, then along the grain, watching thirsty places drink faster than others. The room changed under the oil more quietly than under sanding. Grain deepened, knots warmed. The old paths became visible in a different register, not dirt now, but time. She wiped and wiped until the surface looked almost dry, then left it to cure 48 hours while she lived in the workshop and stepped only along paper paths laid from door to stove. The second coat deepened honey toward amber. The third, after another 2-day cure, brought out colours she had not expected. Reddish-brown near the counter, almost mahogany around the place where generations had stood to speak with customers, golden streaks near the door where sunlight crossed in late afternoon. The floor did not shine like a showroom floor. It held a low, honest glow, the kind that appears only when light has to lean down to find it. On the morning after the second coat, she could not work. No injury announced itself. No fever, no disaster. She woke, sat up, and understood that her body had become an empty shelf. Her hands would not close properly. Her shoulders pulsed with a dull ache from sanding. The smell of oil, though not unpleasant, pressed against her stomach. The room, half-finished and requiring care, seemed suddenly too full of requests. She put on her coat and walked to the marsh. The day was colourless, neither snow nor rain, with the creek moving dark beneath a crust of ice at the edges. She sat on a low stone near the reeds, wrapped her hands in her sleeves, and watched the water move where it remained open. For an hour, nothing happened with dignity. A plastic bottle turned slowly in an eddy. A truck groaned somewhere behind the warehouses. Her feet grew cold. Then a great blue heron lifted from the far bank. It had been invisible until it moved, all grey patience and impossible angles. It rose slowly, legs trailing, wings broad and deliberate, not fleeing so much as choosing a more distant silence. She watched it cross the marsh and settle near the black ribbon of water farther east. The bird did not improve her circumstances. It did not offer meaning. It simply continued being what it was with exactness. She did no work that day. By evening, she returned to the studio, ate bread toasted on the stovetop, checked the oil rags drying safely outside, and slept without guilt because fatigue, too, had to be made honest. February entered through every broken pane. There were 8 windows in the studio, and each had failed in its own manner. 3 had no glass at all, only plywood, cardboard or air. 4 were cracked, some in long diagonal lines, some in spidering stars from old impacts. 1 window, high in the back workshop near the giant globe, was original and older than the building's later changes, its wavy glass held in thin muntins and dated by a penciled note on the sash, 1788, salvaged from the first counting house, reset by E.B., 1912. Samuel saw the note and said, "That one stays." "I know. Good. Some things you do not improve." The original pane was small, uneven, and faintly green at the edge. Looking through it bent the walnut branches into a gentler world. She cleaned it only with water, vinegar, and a cloth, touching the old glass as if it had a pulse. The other 7 demanded labour. Ruth provided DAP 33 glazing putty from a can so old. The label had turned soft at the corners, plus glazier's points, a putty knife, a roll of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord, and 2 salvaged panes cut from storm windows, removed years before from a house on Benefit Street. For the missing panes, Lyra learned to measure not the empty hole but the rabbet where glass should sit, subtracting 1/8 inch so wood could move with weather. Ruth made her repeat the measurements twice and write them in a column. "Glass forgives less than bread," Ruth said. The first sash came out badly. Paint had sealed it in place. The cord had broken long ago, leaving the counterweight loose inside the pocket. When Lyra pried too eagerly, one edge splintered. She stopped, ashamed, then repaired the break with hide glue and a clamp before continuing. Old windows were not obstacles. They were assemblies of agreements. Sash, pulley, cord, weight, stop, rail, putty, glass. Break one agreement and the whole thing punished the hand. She removed the interior stop with a thin pry bar, labelling each piece with pencil because Samuel said houses dislike being reassembled from guesses. She freed the lower sash, lifted it onto the work table, and cut away old putty that had hardened almost to stone. Some came off in chips. Some clung until warmed gently near the stove. The cracked glass lifted out in 2 pieces, each wrapped in newspaper before being placed aside. The glazing bed had to be clean but not gouged. She brushed dust from the rabbit, rubbed a little linseed oil into dry wood so it would not steal oil from the putty, then rolled DAP 33 between her palms into a rope. The putty smelled faintly of oil, chalk and hardware store shelves. She pressed it into the rabbit, set the salvaged glass, wiggled it gently until it rested, then pressed glazier's points every 8 inches with the flat of the putty knife. Her first bevel looked like a child's attempt at icing a cake. She scraped it off and began again. The knife had to travel at a steady angle, edge against glass, shoulder against wood, pressure even. Too little pressure left gaps, too much exposed the rabbit. The line needed to shed water without declaring itself. Ruth demonstrated once on a scrap sash at the store, hand moving so smoothly the putty seemed to understand before the knife arrived. "Do not decorate it," Ruth said. "Weather does not admire." By the 3rd window, Lyra's bevels grew cleaner. By the 4th, she could feel when the putty was too cold and stiff to work, and warmed only the amount she needed in her hands. By the 5th, she had learnt to stop before fatigue made the line ugly. She set each repaired sash near the stove but not too near, letting the putty skin slowly. Paint would wait. Drying demanded patience. The sash cords were their own education. In the front room, 2 windows had counterweights still inside the pockets, heavy iron shapes hidden behind narrow access panels. The old cords had rotted into brown fibres. Ruth's replacement cord was 1/4-inch cotton, firm and clean. Lyra fed it over the pulley, tied it to the counterweight with a figure 8 knot as Ruth had drawn on the back of a receipt, then tested the knot with both hands. The first slipped. She retied it. The second held. The weight descended inside the wall with a satisfying hush, not a crash. She tied the other end to the sash, seated it in the groove, and lifted. The window rose halfway, paused, and stayed. She laughed once. The sound startled her because it had no audience and asked for none. It was not bright. It was brief, almost disbelieving. Then she lowered the sash and raised it again, just to feel balance return to something that had been stuck for years. Cold still entered, the walls still held damp, the roof still had only one proper patch, and the rear floor remained untrustworthy in places, but each glazed pane changed the room's relation to weather. Wind no longer crossed at will through the front. Snow no longer drifted onto the floorboards she had oiled. Light entered through glass instead of absence. On the last February window, the one beside the side door, she worked late into a pale afternoon. The frame had twisted, and the sash required planing before it would sit correctly. She shaved thin curls from the edge with Samuel's borrowed block plane, checking often, refusing the impatience that removes too much and leaves regret. Outside, the second walnut stood black against the washed winter sky. The horseshoe had a rim of frost along its upper curve. She set the glass into the bed of putty, pressed the points, and drew the final bevel in one continuous pass. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was so small against the window that at first she saw only motion, then the round body, black cap, white cheek, grey back, feet gripping the twig with exact confidence. The bird tilted its head and looked into the room through the new glass. Lyra held still with the putty knife in her hand. The chickadee tapped the branch once, not the window, and gave its tidy 2-note call. Then it flew. She stood there until the branch stopped moving. The last window held. Late February found the failed plaster by sound before it found it by sight. The studio walls had looked tired from the first day, but tiredness is not the same as surrender. Much of the original horsehair plaster still held to the hand-split oak lath beneath it, and when Lyra tapped along the front room with the handle of Ruth's putty knife, the good sections answered with a firm, low note, dull but whole. Near the chimney, however, 3 patches answered differently, hollow, brittle, loosened from the wood ribs behind them by years of heat, damp, frost, and neglect. She marked each area with a pencil circle. not trusting the eye alone. The first patch was shoulder-wide above the stovepipe, cracked like dry river mud. The second lay beside the chimney breast, where old water had travelled downward and left a brown stain shaped almost like a wing. The third was smaller, near the baseboard, but when she pressed it with 2 fingers, the surface bowed inward and released a powdery sigh. She stepped back. There was no sense in painting over a lie. Ruth had an answer waiting in the high rear shelf of Delaney's hardware, though she had to stand on a ladder to fetch it. It was a burlap sack tied with string, the label almost unreadable, containing horsehair saved from an old upholstery supply in the 1950s. "Do not ask why I kept it," Ruth said, lowering the sack to the counter. "I was not going to. That is because you have started to learn." The lime came from the same source as the chimney work, but this time the mix needed hair, patience and layers. Samuel explained lath by holding one broken strip in his hands. Oak, split by hand, not sawn, rough enough for plaster keys to grip through the gaps. The old plaster had squeezed between the lath and mushroomed behind it, holding itself like fingers hooked over a rail. Where those keys broke, the wall failed even if the surface still looked complete. "Cut back to what holds," Samuel said. "No farther. No less." She did. The failed plaster came down in curved pieces, some showing the ghost of horsehair in their broken edges, some still carrying bits of lime and sand packed around lath. Dust filled the room despite damp cloth and caution. Behind the broken patches the oak lath waited, darkened but sound. She cleaned gently with a brush, pulled loose keys by hand, and misted everything until the wood no longer looked thirsty. 3 coats, Ruth said. Scratch coat first, coarse, pressed hard through the lath so it formed new keys behind, scored with horizontal lines while still green to give the next layer tooth. Then the brown coat, 3/8 of an inch, levelled but not polished, left 72 hours before the finish. Then the finish coat, 1/8 inch fine and pale, floated smooth enough to take lime wash someday, but not so smooth it would shame the rest of the room. The scratch coat fought her. It was heavier than she expected, and the trowel wanted either to drop too much or smear too little. The lime mortar, sand and horsehair clung in a fibrous mass, reluctant to leave the hawk, then too eager to fall from the wall. She learned to press upward and inward, forcing plaster through the lath gaps until she felt resistance behind the surface. The first handful fell at her feet. She picked it up and began again. Horsehair caught on the trowel edge. Lime burned the splits in her fingers. Her shoulders remembered roof work and protested. But by evening, the 3 patches were covered in rough grey-brown plaster, scored with lines from an old comb Ruth had given her. They looked injured and honest. The room smelled of wet lime, hair, wood, ash, and winter. For 3 days, she protected the patches as if nursing something alive. She misted them lightly so they would not dry too fast. She kept the stove modest. She hung cloth to slow drafts, but not trap damp. She touched the edge each morning, not the face, checking firmness. On the 4th day she laid the brown coat, measuring thickness with a scrap of wood marked at 3/8 inch. She floated it flat by listening through the tool. High places rasped, low places pulled. Samuel came once, looked, and said, "Do not pet it." She drew her hand back. He nodded. Plaster hates affection before it cures. The finish coat took the most nerve because it was thin enough to reveal every hesitation. She mixed finer lime, screened sand, and a little hair cut shorter between scissors. The trowel had to move cleanly. No fussing, no repeated strokes once the surface began to set. The wall accepted the final layer with a pale, settled face. Not perfect, not new, but continuous. When she cleaned the trowel and stepped away, the 3 repairs held the light differently from the surrounding wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. The line came without grandeur, so softly that it might have belonged to the stove, the wall, or the woman who had hidden a letter in the globe. Lyra did not say it aloud. She only set the washed trowel on the counter, rubbed lime from her wrist, and looked at the chimney breast where failure had been cut back, packed, layered, and asked to endure. Doris from the Blue Kettle Cafe began by leaving paper bags on the side step. Not every day, that would have been too much, and Doris understood the preserving dignity of irregular kindness. The first bag appeared on a windy morning in early March, weighted with a clean stone so it would not blow into the lane. Inside were 2 biscuits, a heel of ham wrapped in waxed paper, and an apple with 1 bruise cut neatly away. No note, no name. Only food folded in brown paper, placed where it could be discovered rather than received. Lyra knew anyway. She had seen Doris through the cafe window, broad-hipped and quick-handed, carrying plates along her forearm, pouring coffee without looking, speaking to regulars with an authority that made complaint unnecessary. Doris wore her hair in a dark net at the nape of her neck and kept a pencil behind one ear. Her aprons were always clean at the start of morning and marked by flour before noon. When she laughed inside the cafe, the sound did not cross the street, but her shoulders told the shape of it. On the 3rd paper bag, Lyra went in. The Blue Kettle smelled of coffee, onions on the griddle, yeast rolls, and the lemon oil used on the counter. Men from the salvage yard sat near the front. 2 older women shared toast beneath a wall calendar from a funeral home. Doris was wiping the pie case when Lyra placed the folded bag on the counter, smoothed flat. "I owe you." Doris did not look up. "For what?" "For the food. Not mine. The stone was from your back step. That stone wanders." Lyra waited. Doris finally looked at her, and her eyes were darker than her voice. "If payment is needed, it will be in candles when the shop reopens. It may not reopen. Then I will have invested poorly. I have survived worse." That settled it in Doris's mind. And once Doris settled a matter, the matter lost its right to fidget. The bags continued. Sometimes biscuits, sometimes soup in a jar with the lid tied in cloth. Once, a slice of molasses cake wrapped so carefully it seemed less a dessert than a vote. Caleb arrived with an axe over his shoulder and a bicycle too large for him. He was 16, perhaps 17, all wrists, knees, and earnest height, with a brown Schwinn whose front fender rattled over every stone in the lane. The bike had a wire basket tied to the handlebars with clothesline, and in the basket were 2 split logs, as if he had brought proof of ability. His hair fell into his eyes. His coat sleeves were too short. He leaned the bicycle against the walnut tree and stood outside the side door until Lyra noticed him through the window. "I can split wood," he said. She came to the threshold, wiping plaster dust from her hands. "I do not have money to hire you," my mother said. He stopped there, as though the sentence explained every economy. "Your mother said what? About your grandfather?" The name was not spoken, but it stood between them with the old tools, the repaired maps, the sharpened pencils in the county office. Caleb looked at the ground and moved one boot through the mud. She said he fixed a globe at the school when she was little. Stayed after dark. No charge. She said some debts are sideways. Lyra had no answer for sideways debts. Caleb lifted the splitting maul from his shoulder. It was nearly as tall as the distance from his boot to his chest, old, heavy, with a handle polished where many hands had learned its weight. He set one of the basket logs on the chopping block, raised the maul with a stiff, careful motion, and split it cleanly into 2 pieces, not elegantly cleanly. He came after school twice a week. He would not accept coins, not even when she offered after selling 2 unused brass fittings to Pell Marine Salvage. He accepted water, biscuits from Doris if there were extra, and once a pair of wool gloves Ruth sent by him, because his own had opened at the thumb. He split salvaged wood into stove lengths, stacked it beneath the overhang by size, and taught himself to sharpen the maul with a file while sitting on an upturned crate. He spoke little at first, then in fragments. School was boring, except shop. His mother cleaned rooms at the old hotel. His father drove trucks between Providence and New Bedford. He liked carving, but did not like anyone watching while he did it. He asked once what the giant globe was for. Lyra said she did not know yet. He nodded with a seriousness that accepted not knowing as a proper answer. Reverend Boyd never knocked. He walked past every morning at nearly the same hour, a tall man in a black overcoat gone green at the seams, with a grey scarf tucked under his chin and a hat brushed smoother than the rest of him. The church he served stood beyond the main row of shops. Modest brick, white steeple, bell repaired with fundraising dinners and stubbornness. He had the slow gait of someone who had visited many sickbeds and learned not to arrive breathless. At first, he only tipped his hat from the lane. Lyra would be carrying ash, sweeping glass, sanding a sash, or standing beneath the roof with a pencil behind her ear. He would pause near the walnut tree, lift 2 fingers to the brim, then continue. No questions. No tract. No bright words. His restraint made room for the gesture to continue. One morning, after heavy rain, he found her outside arranging broken bricks into a dry path toward the side door. Her skirt hem was mudded. Her hands were raw. The lane had become a ribbon of thawing earth. He stopped beside the salvage fence. May I pray as I pass? She looked up, unsure what kind of answer such a question expected. He did not wait long enough to make refusal difficult. He bowed his head slightly, still standing in the lane, and said 4 words, "Keep this house breathing." Then he walked on. After that he used the same 4 words most mornings, never louder, never altered, never making the prayer into a performance. Some days Lyra heard them through glass while working inside. Some days she was in the back room and only saw him pass. Some days snow or rain swallowed the words, but she knew their shape by then. The prayer did not convert the building into shelter. It did not patch plaster, buy lime, stretch food, steady ladders, or mend rotten wood, but like Doris's bags and Caleb's split logs, it joined the accumulating proof that a life could be held at its edges by people who did not claim ownership of the center. Quiet help gathered in the studio the way warmth gathered near the stove, unevenly, modestly, enough to keep something from freezing. She postponed the cellar until February 11th because fear sometimes wears the mask of good sequencing. There had always been other work to do first. Roof, chimney floor, windows, plaster, water, wood, stove, each task stood above ground, visible and therefore easier to justify. The cellar waited beneath a trapdoor in the back workshop, half hidden under crates of damaged globe stands and a coil of rope gone stiff with age. She had noticed it during inventory, marked it in the notebook, and then let weather, exhaustion, and prudence build a fence around it. On February 11th, the fence fell. The day was clear and bitter. Sunlight entered through the repaired windows and reached farther across the front room than it had in December. The stove drew well. The floor had cured. The roof patch held. Caleb had split enough wood to last several cold nights, and Ruth had loaned a lantern with a proper chimney. There was no good reason left. She cleared the crates one at a time. The trap-door was made of wide planks cross-braced with iron straps. One strap had rusted loose. The ring pull lay flat in a cup of dirt. She scraped it clean with a nail, oiled the hinges, waited, then lifted. Cold air rose from below, stone-cold mineral and damp without rot. It smelled older than the workshop, not abandoned. Underground. 7 granite steps led down. They were narrow, worn in the middle, and darker along the edges where hands had brushed the wall for balance. She tied Ruth's rope to the iron stove leg, looped it around her wrist, and descended with the lantern held low. The first step was sound, the second too. On the third, something shifted faintly beneath her boot, but not enough to stop her yet. She marked the place in memory and went on. The cellar measured roughly 12 by 15 feet. Fieldstone walls, not brick, a fieldstone floor too, uneven but dry in the centre, damp near the north wall where mineral bloom whitened the joints. The ceiling beams were massive, hand-hewn, their axe marks still visible in lantern light. Spiderwebs occupied corners like old lace. On one wall stood shelves with empty jars, broken crocks, and 2 stoneware jugs. Near the far end, a low arch opened into a crawl space no human body would enter willingly without better reason than curiosity. At the centre of the cellar floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It was not like the surrounding stones. Rectangular, smoothed, fitted with deliberate care. A carved mark sat near its upper edge. A compass rose within a ring, the same symbol pressed into the wax on Miriam's tin box. The cuts were shallow but clear. Not decorative. A craft mark. A signature or a seal. Lyra crouched beside it and held the lantern closer. The slab had edges, but no obvious handle. The mortar line around it was tight. She could have fetched the pry bar. She could have called Samuel. She could have invented enough reasons to lift it before understanding what kind of question it was asking. She did not lift it. Some doors belong to future need, not present hunger. She drew the slab in her notebook, measured it with a length of string, recorded the mark, and left it exactly as it lay. The cellar had already given her enough simply by existing beneath the building like an older memory under speech. On the way up, the third step shifted again. This time she stopped. The granite tread itself was solid, but the wooden riser beneath its front edge had a narrow gap, hidden by dirt and shadow. Something had been wedged there, not recently, not by accident. She set the lantern on the fourth step, lay flat against the staircase wall, and reached under the lip with 2 fingers. Wood met her fingertips, smooth, small, box-shaped. It did not come free. She used the curved knife from the tool shelf gently, then a flat chisel wrapped in cloth. The object resisted, then slid forward all at once, spilling grit onto the step below. It was a small oak box no longer than her hand, darkened but sound, with a lid held closed by a brass hook no bigger than a fingernail. She carried it upstairs before opening it. The workshop light made the box seem less ominous and more intimate. It had been made from quarter-sawn oak, its corners joined with tiny dovetails. No inscription. No lock. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph. The key was small, brighter than expected beneath tarnish, with a bow shaped like a compass rose. Not an exact compass, more like the craft mark simplified for a thumb and forefinger, north, south, east, west, swelling into 4 petals around the hole. Its shaft was narrow and its bit cut in a pattern unlike any door key in the studio. She placed it on the mantel beside the blue candle remnant, where it caught a small line of light, and held it. The photograph required both hands. The tin type was dark until she tilted it, and then the image appeared. A young woman stood in front of the very building, the brick newer, the sign sharper, the walnut tree thinner by half. She wore a high-collared blouse and a long skirt. Her hair was pinned beneath a plain hat. In one hand she held a ruling pen, in the other a curved wooden gore form. Her face, though separated by time chemistry and the sternness required by old cameras, carried Lyra's own bones with unsettling patience, the same brow, the same mouth inclined toward silence, the same eyes set as if looking required responsibility. Lyra sat down before her knees chose for her. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, Miriam Bellamy, daughter of Elias, age 25, summer of 1903. The young woman in the photograph had stood at the side door before wars. Silness, county notices, roof leaks, hidden money, vanished heirs, and a stranger sleeping on the front room floor. She had stood there holding a tool of the trade, not smiling, not performing, only present. Lyra placed the tin type beside Tomash's note and Miriam's letter. Family had become less simple and more exact. Blood might be there. It might not. Records would need searching. Names would need following through marriage, migration, loss, and clerks who wrote carefully enough for the future. But the face in the photograph did not demand proof that afternoon. It asked only to be kept dry. The brass key stayed on the mantel. She did not yet know what it opened. That was all right. The studio had begun to teach her that every hidden thing did not need to become immediate possession. Some secrets ripened under attention. Some waited until the hand had learned enough not to take them apart. By March, snow retreated in dirty seams from the edges of the lane. It did not vanish nobly. It shrank around cinders, rusted nails, walnut shells, and old leaves, exposing the winter's ledger one damp line at a time. The creek behind the property grew loud with snowmelt, moving faster than its narrow banks seemed able to hold. At night she could hear it from the side door when the wind came from the marsh, a dark water sound beneath the city's engines and the salvage yards settling metal. The walnut trees changed first in their tips. Before leaves, before green, before anything a hurried person would call spring, the branches loosened into catkins, small and pendant, catching light on warmer afternoons. The horseshoe in the second walnut shed its rim of frost and darkened with rain. Birds returned by increments. Chickadees, then sparrows, then one red-winged blackbird at the marsh whose shoulder flashed like a coal in wet reeds. The studio opened slowly to the season. Lyra began leaving the side door ajar during the warmest part of the day. Air moved through the repaired windows and across the oiled pine floor, carrying out the winter's closed breath. The plaster patches cured pale and firm. The roof patch endured the first hard spring rain without surrender. The chimney rested, swept and repointed. The stove no longer seemed like a stranger on the mantel. The small brass key sat beside the blue candle remnant, the medal packet, and one walnut shell Caleb had carved into the shape of a boat while pretending not to. People asked when she would begin making globes. Not many people. Ruth asked without asking, by setting aside scraps of linen paper. Doris asked by saying she knew a schoolteacher who admired handmade things. Caleb asked plainly, standing beside the giant sphere with wood chips in his hair. Reverend Boyd did not ask. He prayed his 4 words and trusted time. Lyra did not begin that spring. The decision surprised her only because it felt so steady. The tools had waited decades. The work could wait 1 season more. Her hands had become strong from repair, but strength and readiness were not the same. She knew how to clean a chimney now, how to oil a floor, how to pack mortar, how to glaze glass, how to listen for rot. She did not yet know how to honor a sphere large enough to hold a world, so she began smaller. She chose 1 coin from the pouch, a worn mercury dime whose date had nearly disappeared, and took it to a coin dealer Ruth trusted in Pawtucket. She sold only that one, not because she needed so little, but because beginning with restraint made the rest safer. With the money, she ordered wheat starch, linen paper, gum arabic, rabbit skin glue, chalk, and 3 mineral pigments in modest amounts: ultramarine, yellow ochre, iron red. No extravagance, no studio ribbon, no sign painter. Materials first. She practiced on samples no larger than oranges. Layer 1 with grain crossing. Dry 12 hours. Layer 2 diagonal. Layer 3 aligned to intended gore. She mixed paste by weight, not guesswork, and strained it through linen as Miriam had instructed. She kept the samples away from stove blast and wrote temperatures in the notebook morning and evening: 59 degrees near the work table, 64 by the stove, 57 near the side door, too cold, move the drying rack inward, too dry, cover loosely. The first sample buckled. She cut it open, studied the failure, and wrote, rushed second layer. Paste too thick. Paper stretched unevenly. The second cracked at the seam. The third held its shape but showed brush marks in the gesso. The fourth accepted sanding. Progress did not announce itself. It accumulated like kindling. By April, the front room no longer looked rescued from demolition so much as held in probation by care. The oiled floor glowed when afternoon sun crossed it. The repaired windows wavered slightly where salvaged glass bent light. The counter had been cleaned but not polished. The brass compass without glass lay in a shallow tray. The ledger slowly dried, remained swollen but readable in places. On one wall she hung a single paper gore to dry, blank and pale, shaped like a narrow leaf from an unknown tree. She had not restored the studio. She had only convinced it, one exact repair at a time, to remain. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished globe stood on the front counter where the ruined ledger had once lain swollen shut. It was not large, 8 inches in diameter, mounted on a salvaged walnut base that Caleb had turned by hand after months of practicing on scraps, then sanded until the wood looked dark and close-grained, almost solemn. The meridian ring was brass, cleaned but not made bright enough to lie about age. The sphere itself had taken Lyra 7 attempts before she allowed this one to become more than an exercise. Papier-mâché over a light wooden core, 6 coats of gesso, pumice sanding between every second coat. Oceans in 2 washes, the second wetter along the equator, so winter light moved there softly. Continents drawn in ink so fine that even Ruth had leaned over it without speaking. The place names were few. Rhode Island coast, Narragansett Bay, Providence, Bristol, New Bedford, Pawtucket, Brockton, Harlem, written small across the Atlantic because lineage sometimes crosses water before it knows what it is carrying. In the lower curve where most globes might place a maker's mark, Lyra had painted a compass rose no larger than a thumbnail. M. Bellamy Daughters. Fox Point, Providence. The plural had made her hand pause before writing it, not because she doubted it, because some words require the body to understand them before ink does. The brush tip touched the surface, drew the S in one continuous curve, and left it there to dry. The restored interior remained modest enough that a careless visitor might have missed the magnitude of it. The front room held the counter, repaired but still scarred. 2 shelves displayed sample spheres, pigment jars, repaired compasses, and blank paper gauze clipped by wooden pins. The oiled pine floor had darkened further with use and stove heat, honey deepened toward brown where footsteps had returned. The plaster patches near the chimney had cured into the wall's older face, visible only in certain light. The windows opened and closed most days. The stove burned clean. A braided rug from Doris lay near the counter, worn but warm underfoot. Caleb's chopped wood was stacked by the side door in strict rows he pretended were accidental. The back workshop remained a working room, not a museum. The giant demonstration globe stood at the centre, still unfinished, but no longer surrounded by ruin. Its cedar compartment was sealed properly now, the broken peg repaired, the meridian brace tightened, the secret within arranged with deliberate care. The money, most of it, had not been moved elsewhere, neither had the maps. They rested in cedar darkness wrapped against damp, documented in a notebook whose first page read, "Not for sale, not for showing without cause, not mine alone." The cellar key found its purpose on a day cold enough to make the walnut bark ring under her knuckles. It had taken 2 years because she had stopped forcing questions before their season. The brass key sat on the mantel through spring, summer, autumn, winter, and spring again. It watched repairs, practice, failures, visitors, mail orders, Ruth's inspections, Doris's deliveries, Caleb's growth from awkward boy to long-armed young man with sawdust in every cuff. It did not fit any cabinet, drawer, lockbox, side door, cellar chest, or compartment she tried in the first weeks. After that, she left it alone. On December 7th, 2024, after returning from town, she noticed the horseshoe in the second walnut had changed. Not changed, exactly revealed. A strip of bark below it had fallen away in the previous night's freeze, exposing a small brass plate set into the trunk beneath an overgrown fold of wood. It was green with age, and almost flush, held by 2 tiny screws. At its centre was a keyhole narrow enough that a larger key would never have entered. She stood beneath the tree for a long time, her breath white in the air. The brass key fit. It did not turn easily. Nothing important in that place ever had. She warmed the key in her palm, used 1 drop of oil, waited and tried again. The plate released with a soft click. A small panel disguised as bark and brass opened outward from the walnut trunk just below the horseshoe, revealing a cavity lined in tin. The tree had grown around it without swallowing it, or perhaps someone long dead had understood the tree well enough to leave room for growth. Inside lay a folded flag and a note. The flag was small, not a burial flag, but a hand-folded 48-star American flag, its cotton yellowed, its stars arranged in neat rows from the years before Alaska and Hawaii joined the count. It had been wrapped in oilcloth with cedar shavings. Beneath it, in an envelope, brittle with cold, was a note written in a stronger, older hand than Miriam's. To the daughter who finds what we could not carry indoors. I am Mercy Wetherell Bellamy, and I write this on April 7th, 1865. While Providence bells ring for news from Virginia, and no one knows yet what peace will cost. My brother Amos carried this flag in a Rhode Island regiment until fever took him near Petersburg. He asked, before he went, that it not be sold, not be buried where strangers might move it, and not be hung in any parlour by those who loved the appearance of sacrifice more than its weight. Elias is only 7 and does not understand why men leave farms and shops to fight over whether other men may own the bodies of the living. Some day he will understand enough to grieve. If the house stands, keep this where working hands pass, near the iron shoe, Annalise said would hold luck for those who did not trust luck alone. A flag is cloth unless someone pays for its meaning. Do not worship it. Do not waste it. Let it remind you that every map of this country has been drawn over suffering and hope together. If our daughters endure, let them make honest things. Mercy Wetherell Bellamy, Providence, Rhode Island, April 7th, when 865. Lyra carried the flag and note inside with the same care she had once given the first letter. The date placed Mercy's words 2 days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, though Mercy could not have known what would follow. The war year sat in the ink like a coal that had not gone out. Lyra laid the flag on the counter, still folded, and did not open it fully. Some cloth is weakened by admiration. She placed the note beneath glass in a shallow frame Ruth helped her find, and the flag returned, after careful wrapping, to a new cedar box inside the studio, no longer in the tree where weather might one day exceed intention. The World War II Victory Medal found its place the following Memorial Day. On May 27, 2024, Lyra took the medal, Miriam's letter, and one small globe sample to the Rhode Island Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Exeter, after Ruth helped her identify the closest proper record for Daniel Maren through county archives, newspaper notices, and a veterans hospital entry that listed a man returned from service and buried without much ceremony. The grave marker did not say globe maker's son. Stones rarely have room for the gentler truths. She cleaned the marker with water and a soft brush. No polish. No scraping, only water, cloth, and time. Then she set the medal on the grass long enough for morning light to touch the faded ribbon. She did not leave it there, because keeping was part of honouring too. She read Daniel's name once along with the year, and placed beside the stone a paper rose she had made from scrap linen, its stem weighted with a small pebble. By noon she returned the medal to the studio and wrote in the notebook, "Taken to Daniel, Memorial Day, weather clear, grass wet." The money remained mostly where Miriam had hidden it. In 2 years, Lyra spent only 3 coins and 2 bills from the cachet itself, and each was recorded with almost severe exactness. 1 mercury dime for first practice materials, 1 silver quarter to pay for archival sleeves after the old maps showed signs of edgeware, 1 worn buffalo nickel sold to a collector Ruth trusted to buy a thermometer and humidity gauge for the workshop, 2 older $5 bills exchanged through the bank with Mrs. Porter's guidance went toward repairing the side door threshold before another winter could eat it further. Everything else stayed sealed for the next one. Those words had come from Lyra's own hand before she entirely understood them. The next one might be kin, might be apprentice, might be stranger, might be someone hungry enough to mistake money for rescue until the house taught otherwise. She bought no fine coat, no new furniture beyond what work required, no public announcement, no ornament designed to prove that ruin had been defeated. Ruin had not been defeated, it had been negotiated with day by day until it gave back rooms. The water maps remained private. Twice men came asking after rumors, once a developer with polished boots and a smile that never reached the colder parts of his face, once a municipal consultant who used the phrase community resource 4 times before accepting that she had not invited him to sit. Lyra showed neither the maps nor anger. She offered tea when manners required it, listened and said only that any historical material would be reviewed by proper archivists when the time was right. Then she closed the door. Mrs. Porter knew more than most and said less than anyone. In the bottom drawer of her county annex desk, she kept the original $4 Lyra had paid at the liquidation, not deposited, not entered into the cash bag after the sale had been reversed through a technical notation. No one upstairs cared to investigate. 4 single bills, flattened and clipped to a copy of the receipt, lay beneath a packet of old tax stamps. When asked why she kept them, she said, clerical reference. Her niece, now grown and working part-time in the office, knew better than to ask twice. The shop reopened without an opening. There was no ribbon, no article, no mayor, no polished sign at first. Doris simply pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a lost cat notice and a flyer for snowblower repair. Hand-marred globes and chart repair. OLD Fox Point Globe Works. Inquiries by mail or note. NO walk-ins during wet varnish. Below it, in Doris's handwriting, was an arrow and the sentence, patient work. Worth waiting for. The first note came from a school teacher in Bristol whose classroom globe had lost Greenland. Then a retired sailor brought a chart of Narragansett Bay torn along a fold. Then a woman mailed a celestial globe from Vermont with Orion rubbed thin by children's hands. Lyra took only what she could do without haste. She wrote estimates in pencil. She refused work that required lying about age. She repaired what could be repaired and returned what could not with careful explanation. By the second winter, the mailing list had 43 names. Some were customers, some were simply people who wanted to know when the next small globe would be ready. Ruth's name was not on it because Ruth said she did not need mail to learn what was happening 4 doors down. Doris demanded to be listed twice, once for herself and once for the cafe. Though Lyra crossed out the duplicate when Doris was not looking, Reverend Boyd asked for no list. He continued walking past, though not every day now, and when he prayed, he still used the same 4 words. Keep this house breathing. Caleb returned with the sign on a clear afternoon after the first finished globe had dried fully. He was taller than when he had first leaned the Schwinn against the walnut tree, though the bicycle still appeared more repaired than original. His shoulders had widened from splitting wood and shop class. He had begun shaving unevenly. In his hands he carried a plank of walnut wrapped in an old feed sack. He would not let Lyra touch it until they stood beneath the weathered sign over the front door. Close your eyes, he said. She did not. He sighed. Ruth said you would not. That sounds like Ruth. He unwrapped the plank. The sign was hand-carved, not perfect, and therefore beautiful in a way perfection often misses. He had copied the old lettering from the surviving board above the entrance, but deepened it, steadied it, and added what the first sign had carried only as singular memory. M. Bellamy Daughters. Terrestrial and celestial globes. Charts repaired by hand. The plural S was carved with unusual care, its curve slightly deeper than the rest, as if he had gone over it more than once. Around the border he had cut a simple compass rose pattern, north and south longer than east and west. The walnut had been oiled until its grain moved under the light like dark water. I know it is not exact, Caleb said quickly. The old one says daughter. But Doris said it ought to say more. And Ruth said if I was going to do it, I should stop hovering around and carve the truth. Lyra touched the carved letters with 2 fingers. Did Ruth say it that gently? No. They hung it together with Samuel supervising from below, though he insisted he had not come to supervise. Caleb held the ladder. Lyra guided the left chain. Samuel said the right side was low, then high, then tolerable. Ruth watched from the sidewalk with her arms folded. Doris came out of the cafe wearing her flowery apron and pretended she had stepped outside only to shake a mat. Reverend Boyd paused at the walnut tree and removed his hat. When the sign settled into place, the lane seemed to change its grammar. Not loudly, nothing in that place changed loudly, but the building had a name again that did not belong only to the past. Daughters, plural, allowed room for women dead, living, unknown, unborn, chosen and found. It made the work less narrow than blood and more demanding than ownership. Lyra stood beneath it until her neck ached from looking upward. That night, after everyone had gone and the sign had stopped swinging in the faint wind, she began her own letter. She took 8 sheets of good paper from the drawer, not the oldest paper, not the finest. Paper meant to last, but not too precious to receive an honest hand. The stove burned steadily. The first completed globe rested under a cloth on the counter. The brass key lay beside the blue candle remnant. Miriam's letter, Mercy's note, Tomasha's folded slip, and her own notebook lay open within reach. She sharpened a pencil first, then another. The old ritual returned without needing to be summoned. Tools set in order, paper squared, hands washed, lamp trimmed, breath given time to settle. She did not know who would read what she was about to write. She did not know whether the reader would have her name, her face, her hunger, her losses, or no relation except the difficult grace of arriving when something had been kept. She dipped the pen. The first words were already waiting because they did not belong to her alone. My dear one, whoever you are. She paused after the line and listened. Outside December wind moved through the walnut branches and touched the new sign, making the chain give one small sound against the bracket. In the workshop, the giant globe stood in its cradle, unfinished still, because some masterworks are allowed to remain longer than one life can complete. On the shelf, practice spheres dried in a row, their blank surfaces waiting for oceans. The stove held fire without smoke, the floor held her chair, the walls held their patches, the house held breath. She wrote slowly. She wrote of the night she arrived with rain in her shoes. She wrote of roof seams, creosote, lime, glass, hunger, and the danger of spending too quickly what was given for endurance. She wrote that money is not rescue unless it becomes shelter, food, tools, and time. She wrote that no person should be asked to earn kindness by telling all their pain first. She wrote the names she knew: Tomash, Miriam, Mercy, Daniel, Ruth, Doris, Caleb, Samuel, Reverend Boyd, Mrs. Porter. She left space for names still unknown. She did not write Nathaniel's name. Some people do not deserve the honor of being stored in the house. She wrote instead of silence and how it can harm when used to abandon and heal when used to listen. She wrote of the water maps and the need to protect what belongs to the living. She wrote of the small brass key and the flag from the tree. She wrote of the horseshoe grown into bark and the way luck, if it existed at all, had seemed to prefer calloused hands and repaired thresholds. Near midnight, she set the pen down and flexed her fingers. The first page had dried. The second waited. There would be more to say, but not everything had to be finished that night. Letters, like houses, could be built in sections if the foundation was true. She rose and crossed to the front window. The lane lay under a thin new snow, not enough to trouble the roof, only enough to gather light. The sign above the door was unreadable from inside, but she knew the letters. The walnut tree stood still, holding iron, memory, and the hidden place where the flag had waited through seasons no living person had counted. Beyond the salvage yard, beyond the row of practical shops, beyond the harbour, the Atlantic lay dark and immense, touching other coasts she might never see but could draw if given time. A handmade globe waits. It has always waited. On Monday morning, Mrs. Porter opened the bottom drawer of her desk at the county annex to retrieve a packet of tax stamps. She saw the 4 bills clipped to the old receipt and stopped for half a breath as she did sometimes. The paper had softened at the folds. One bill still carried a faint brown line from the hem where it had once been hidden. She touched the clip, not the money, then closed the drawer before the young clerk at the next desk could ask what she was looking at. Outside, the county building received people with folders, complaints, proofs. And questions. Window 3 opened. The brass stamp waited on its pad, and in the forgotten lane near Fox Point, beneath a walnut sign carved with a plural promise, a lamp burned in the globe maker's studio while Lyra bent over the next blank sphere, drawing the first careful line of shore.